We are live. My name is Derek Lambert. I'm the host of a channel called Myth Vision Podcast. And you might be asking yourself the question, why are we having this conversation again on the topic of slavery and the Bible? We have two gentlemen from each side. One is the Christian side, Christian apologists, and the other from a critical scholarly standpoint. I don't want to identify them in a way that they may not be, but I think they're atheist. I could be mistaken here completely. But that being said, let's introduce our guest. You're going to hear a different kind of conversation we hope to start having more often with those who we don't agree with. And that being said, let's start with Dr. Kipp next to me, I guess.
Oh, hey Derek, how you doing? Hi everyone. I guess we're starting with just introductions. My name is Kipp Davis. I'm a biblical scholar and a specialist in the Hebrew Bible and early Judaism and the Dead Sea Scrolls. I run a YouTube channel that's just under my name, Kipp Davis, and I make content over there tackling anything and everything related to the text of the Bible, ancient Israelite religion, and early Judaism.
And then we have Dr. Josh.
All right. I'm Joshua Bowen. I am an Assyriologist with Hebrew Bible stuff as well, but I kind of work in the ancient Near East, and this has become sort of my topic that I'm known for better or for worse. So I just we have a YouTube channel called Digital Hammurabi. But we just sort of work with the ancient world and the Hebrew Bible.
And Gavin, I didn't know what you wanted me to call you, so I'm just calling you Gavin.
His esteemed eminence, Dr. Reverend Ortlund.
I forgot.
I told you, we practiced this. Come on. Gavin Ortlund. I run the channel Truth Unites, and I do my academic work is in historical theology. I do a little bit in other fields as well, not a lot. That's my main academic focus. In terms of my broader ministry and writing, I do different kinds of apologetics, but I would just say broadly Christian apologetics. Well, I could say a word about what leads us up to this video, but maybe I'll do that after Trent gets a chance to introduce himself too.
Well, mine's very brief. My name is Trent Horn. I'm the host of the Council of Trent podcast. I think I'm the only panelist here who doesn't have a PhD. I don't think that's ever they won't let me trade my 3 master's degrees in for 1 PhD. I wish there was a way you could just do that. You could just trade them in, but whatever.
It needs to be I host Settlers of Catan version.
Yeah. I have
right?
masters for sheep, master's degrees for sheep. So I host the Council of Trent podcast. I've written several books. I wrote a book called Hard Sayings, The Catholic Approach to Answering Bible Difficulties. I primarily articulate and defend the Catholic worldview, Catholic faith, but a lot of times I find myself engaging critics of Christianity on a whole host of issues. And I believe it's important to foster dialogue and engaging, opposing arguments. And Gavin said, hey, they asked me to come talk to them. There's going to be 2 of them. So do you want to come talk with me? I said, sure. That sounds like fun. Gavin and I have done debates against each other before, so it's kind of fun to be on the same side for this one.
And Gavin, what led us to this? And then if you don't mind, I'll have a final word before I disappear.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. I had put out one video on slavery in the Bible, maybe like an hour video, just kind of basically giving like an overview of a Christian response to some of the, especially I think I had 4 YouTubers in mind that I was responding to, basically just a sort of Christian apologetics video on slavery in the Bible. You guys had made a response to that. I made a response to you, and both of us had kind of mentioned, hey, let's talk as well. And so then we got in touch, and I think you guys suggested, well, why don't you bring someone along to make it not even appear like it's a mismatch in terms of the number of people involved on each side. And I thought of Trent, both for my respect for him, but also just I do think it's fun. Trent and I have debated against each other. So it is fun to be on the same side for once. So I think this will be a productive conversation. One thing I wanted to say too is the way I approach these, and Derek, you were just saying this, and you may say this again, but we're probably not going to convince each other. But there's such a value in productive dialogue just to clarify where the disagreements are. So even if we just have a modest goal like that, I think that's tremendously valuable.
Thank you. Yeah. I am just going to be hosting today, kind of refereeing if necessary, but to help nudge this to go along. Because sometimes in these kind of conversations, we get so caught up in the weeds that we don't realize how do we get out of the ditch and back on the road, heading to the next destination. So we're going to cover several topics in different locations, I imagine, in the Bible. I'm hoping to nudge us along as we go, but they know what they're going to want to talk about more than me. So I feel like my only involvement will be if someone's hogging the mic, and I don't mean any disrespect. I'm going to try and be as balanced and neutral and fair. I am on everyone's side on this to allow the conversation to go forward. And just like Gavin said, I don't imagine, and I don't know if you probably count on one hand in history, real serious debates that in the middle of a debate, someone changed their mind based on the opponent's position. So it's really for you, the person who's viewing this or listening to this, that you can decide what makes the most sense in your head. And if you see shortcomings on either end, take your own position. And I'm going to back out, allowing all four of you to have a free, open dialogue. We want to make this as less formal as possible and being able to just communicate as normal humans without too much tension and professionality causing us to feel like we have to be correct or right on every single point and making it combative. We're trying to create a different environment. With that being said, I'm going to back out. We're going to make a hard stop
Derek,
at 2.5 hours.
Did you want to
and
mention
one more thing? If you super chat us,
Yep.
the panel appreciates it. We thank you. We will not take questions. There's too much to talk about, but we may do follow-up lives and address those super chats that you give today. So we all want to thank you for supporting us, whoever you are, wherever you are. Are you ready, gentlemen?
Yeah, I think
All
so.
right. I'm backing out.
So, just to give everyone an idea of how we laid this out, we put together about 5 or 6 individual talking points or topics that we'd like to delve into and to discuss. And I think a big part of what prompted this too was I noticed in Gavin's response video to us, he was frustrated. You were frustrated, Gavin, that you felt like we weren't listening to what you were saying and to your argument. And this was sort of the reaction that Josh and I had too when you made your response video. We're like, there's just so many things that were missed that it seemed productive, I think, to all of us, that this is the sort of topic, this is the sort of thing that's productive if we sit down and talk face to face, so that everybody isn't speaking past each other.
And I wasn't frustrated, just to clarify that. I mean,
Okay.
this happens all the time. It's a part of all ideological clash. Sometimes it's kind of amusing, actually.
It is. I mean, I think I'm operating under the expectation now that I'm going to feel like I'm being taken out of context or cherry picked or misread all the time. So, but just to give the audience an idea, we thought we would just each start with a basic statement about where we want to go tonight and how we each individually, each side wants to set this up. And it's useful too, I think, if each of us steelmans the other person's position, and then we can get into it. So, without further ado, do you have Josh has some slides, and I think we'll just go through a
You guys
3-minute.
are formal. I think I just suggested give an initial kind of overview of our thoughts and then
I
steel
know,
man the other
but
side. So I didn't know we were coming with a formal thing, but go for
No,
it.
it's
No.
like 3 minutes. It's just
And
thought it'd
Josh
be easier.
loves slides, so
Yeah, I'm that kind of guy.
it's so you're ready to go there, Josh. So so for us, for the two of us, Josh and me in particular, we're text guys, and our interest tends to be focused rather rigidly on what the text says and what it means, and attempting to understand and to derive where it came from and where it's going. So in preparing for tonight and thinking through tonight, we thought it was useful to start with this question of what slavery, what was slavery like as described in the Hebrew Bible. So we've come up with a basic definition, which is fairly similar to numerous definitions of slavery from specialists on the topic. We define slavery in this context as a condition in which an individual or rights to their labor is owned by another, either temporarily or permanently. The owner controls and may benefit from the actions and activities of the owned individual. So there are three primary sections in the law collections of the Old Testament that concern slavery. And this is really where a lot of Josh's and my interest is focused. The first is in Exodus 21, which deals with Hebrew male debt slaves that can only be made to work as a slave for 6 years to completely pay off their debt. The law allows them to convert their status to chattel slave if they are given a slave wife with whom he produces children who belong to the master and his property, and he wishes to remain with them. Then verses 7-11 concern a female slave that is sold by her father to pay on a debt. She is not to be released, as she has been taken as either a concubine or a wife. Given the use of her sexual capacities, she has been devalued, and the law seeks to protect that vulnerable state. Verses 20-21 and then 26-27 describe what would happen to a debt slave that was killed by a beating. The master would be killed. If he did not die from the beating, however, the master was not to be punished. If the master were to knock out the eye or the tooth of a slave, which is regarded as a serious offense in the book of Exodus, the debt slave was to be released and the debt forgiven. So the second set of laws appears in Deuteronomy 15. Verses 12-18 covers much of what was covered in Exodus, but with some developments. In particular, an Israelite debt slave was to be released with sufficient provisions so as not to easily fall back into debt, and the female slaves are to be treated as the male slaves. And then finally, there's another section in Leviticus chapter 25, verses 39-55, where we see slavery rules for both Israelites, and now this is new, Israelites as well as foreigners. So Israelites that sell themselves to other Israelites are not to be treated as slaves, according to Leviticus 25, but rather as hired workers and set free in the year of Jubilee, which is every 50th year and not every 7th year, as I see so frequently on Twitter. Excuse me. This release was also required if an Israelite sold himself to a foreigner, and a near relative was to do all they could to redeem that Israelite who had sold themselves. However, these rules did not apply to foreigners. Those from the surrounding nations and from tenant farmers living in their midst could be taken as permanent or chattel slaves. They could be kept for life, passed on as an inheritance, and made to serve permanently. Now, the laws that we see in the Hebrew Bible differ little from what we see in the rest of the ancient Near East. A few examples of the well-known laws of Hammurabi can illustrate some of this. The laws of Hammurabi 1:15 states that if a man legally distrains someone from a debtor's household and they die naturally, there is no basis for a claim. However, in 1:16, if the distrained individual dies from a beating, then the law of retaliation applies. If it was a free son that died, then the free son or the creditor would die. If a slave of a debtor, then the creditor would pay the price of the slave, which was 20 shekels of silver. Then in Laws of Hammurabi 1:17, if a free person goes into debt slavery, they can be made to serve for 3 years rather than the biblical 6 years. So what was life like as a slave? Well, the biblical text indicates rather resoundingly that this was not a desirable position to be in. We see this in such texts as 2 Kings chapter 4, verse 1, Leviticus 25, verses 39 to 43, as we already mentioned. The book of Job describes the stereotypical slave panting for the shade in Job 7:2, and is distinguished in this text from a hired person who is waiting for his wages. It was expected that slaves would be physically disciplined. Proverbs 29, verses 29 and verse 21 indicate this. Slaves were seen to be of a lower social status and were used rhetorically to describe things out of control or in chaos. For example, the roles of slaves and those of higher status were being reversed. We see this in texts like Proverbs 31, 21 to 23, and Ecclesiastes 10, verse 7. The bodies of slave women were not their own. Slaves were used for producing heirs, and the consent of a slave girl was not required for her to be taken as a wife or a concubine. You see this in Genesis 33, Exodus 21, 7 to 11, Deuteronomy 21, 10 to 14. So in short, slavery in the Hebrew Bible is neither a good kind of slavery, nor is it substantially or fundamentally better than what we find in the law collections of the ancient Near East. And I hope this is something that we can talk through in greater detail as we go forward this evening.
Okay, great. All right. Well, yeah, like I said, when we had planned out, I think on the sheet of paper I first sent out with the order of things, I think I just mentioned, just give a brief statement of kind of where we're coming from and then Steelman the other side. So all I was thinking of doing here on our side is just sort of laying out a framework of what we're arguing for.
This is my fault, Gavin. Sorry, I got carried away.
Truly, it's helpful. It's helpful, and I'll hope to then Steelman it well, because with the slides will help with that. So it's good. And what you shared is good. So thank you. But just explaining to the audience why we don't have a big presentation here. So no, I mean, the thing I would, and actually this will be helpful to say up front, and then I'll let Trent, my brother Trent, add on what he wants to add on here as well. But basically, we will not be arguing that the slavery laws of the Old Testament reflect an ideal that is timeless, that we should follow today or something like that. So a relevant passage that I brought up, I think in my initial video, and I think again, is Matthew 19:8, where Jesus is referencing divorce laws of Deuteronomy 24. And he says they were permitted or allowed because of hardness of heart. So it's a sort of concession to human sin, but they're not given as an ideal, even right there in Jesus's context. And in general, if you look at society's laws, you'll find the behaviors being regulated are oftentimes there'll be regulations for gambling or prostitution or something like this that clearly are not viewed as ideal, but there's laws trying to regulate them. So, and I think Trent and I are of one mind on this, that what we're going to be arguing instead is, and the way I put it in one of my theses in my original video, is that the Old Testament laws about slavery represented a significant improvement upon general ancient Near Eastern practice. And the two passages that I really emphasized in my response to you guys were Exodus 21, verses 26 to 27, physical harm to the slave from the master, and then Deuteronomy 23 and the protection of runaway foreign slaves. And so all I'm trying to do right now is just sort of specify where the nub of disagreement is, and that is, were the Old Testament laws about slavery an improvement upon the broader ancient Near Eastern world? And so to me, that helps to frame it like that, because that's where we're going to clash. In fact, I'm going to hold up your book, Josh, in case we can sell a few copies to people watching. I just reread a lot of this. I know Trent's been looking at it as well. And even the very last sentence of your book, I was realizing there's a lot of points where we're actually not going to disagree. And so that's what I'm trying to frame where we do disagree in terms of this point. Old Testament laws, did they make improvements on the ancient Near East? So that's where I'm trying to frame kind of where we're coming from, what we'll get into, and so forth. Trent will clarify if I've said any heresy.
Well, not in this video, Gavin. There's other videos, but
Don't
because
say
if your
those now,
listeners
though.
don't know, I'm Catholic and Gavin's Protestant. But this is something where we certainly have common ground. And actually, he and I have a lot of common ground. There could be other Protestants, even Catholics, who would approach the issue a little differently. I think I'm just going to add a few points just to supplement some of what Gavin said, because I'm basically in agreement. From a Catholic perspective, Pope Benedict XVI once said, biblical revelation is deeply rooted in history. God's plan is manifested progressively. It's accomplished slowly in successive stages, and despite human resistance, God chose a people and patiently worked to guide and educate them. I think what we're discussing here is interesting. When you talk about the subject of slavery in the Bible, there's really two distinct questions. One is an empirical, historical question that even atheists could disagree about and talk about. It's not even really a religious question. It's, what was slavery like? What were the conditions like? What was this institution like? And I think that's essentially what we're going to be discussing here. But I do think that a specter hanging over the entire discussion for most people watching this, because most people who investigate this topic, they're not ancient Near Eastern nerds who just like read the Middle Assyrian palace decrees for fun or something like that. You're not a nerd, Josh, in spite of the bow tie, but which are always flashy, always good to have.
I haven't seen that one before, actually.
So I think many people watching there, it's a larger question. It's a philosophical, religious question of, does the condition of slavery in the Hebrew Bible, does that invalidate the Bible's claim to divine inspiration, things like that? That's more of a philosophical, religious, ethical debate that's secondary to this, that we're not really going to get into. But I think that the facts of slavery do play into those debates often. So I appreciated in Josh's book saying, there's people Christians who downplay biblical slavery, and there's atheists who overplay the harms and evils that were involved in this institution. I also think when we talk about this, if you say, well, what was slavery like? And your slideshow was very helpful to go through the passages. I think also to understand an institution, you have to understand the world around it. Like if I gave a presentation in the year 3000 on what was factory farming like in the year 2024, and I just said, here's what they did with factory farming of animals for consumption, it would probably look pretty gruesome. But it wouldn't be the full picture to understand if people watching that presentation in the year 3000 thought, what cruel people. Why didn't they all just farm all of their meat for everyone in labs like we do today? Well, here's the context that this is how we feed people. This is how the economies work at this time. This is what's necessary to sustain a population of 7 billion people. So I do think that has to also be taken into account as to why the institution of slavery exists. For example, in the ancient world, if you have someone who's a thief who cannot repay goods and you don't have a prison to lock them up in, many times they're sentenced to forced labor to repay their debt. That would be slavery, something we wouldn't do today, but it's much more understandable and in more dilapidated conditions. And I appreciated what Josh put in his opening slide. I do think, though, when you look at slavery, we also have to be careful not to isolate it from the general conditions of the time. So I would say when you put down, not desirable, panting for the shade, physical discipline, lower status, woman's body not her own, that's not just about slavery per se. This is just essentially the ancient Near East. That's just essentially the ancient Near East, that most people had a lifestyle that was not very desirable, living hand to mouth, subsistence, one bad crop or one raiding party away from death, panting for the shade. Even the hired workers, true, they waited for their wage, but sometimes the wages didn't come. So the slave sometimes had security, the hired worker didn't. It's a bit of a trade-off there. Physical discipline of the slave, that's absolutely true, but everybody was physically disciplined. You used the rod on your children, the rod would be used on spouses, kings would use them on servants, anyone in authority. Corporal punishment was just an accepted fact of life, and it's something to debate about whether it's appropriate or not. And similar, being of lower status and women's agency. If you were a non-slave female, it's not like you certainly did not have the agency women have today, that's for sure. So I do think it's important to understand that God selected a people, and what we're saying is, he moved them in an ancient society, and society didn't change overnight. And this institution existed within that very, very different world from where we live today, very hard to understand. And it's important for us when we talk about to make sure we get the background knowledge right and we understand the particular facets of the institution. So I hope that was helpful.
All right.
Yeah, it was
Well, that's
excellent.
good.
Do you want me to do the steel man, Kipp?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. So, I've said this on any number of streams. I think that this position that you guys are arguing for is the strongest of all the apologetic arguments that I've heard. So if I return to Christianity, is probably the one that I would argue as well. As our marriage counselor years ago said, you want to start off with what I hear you saying is, so that's what I'll do here. What I hear you saying is that the ancient world needs to be understood in its broader context, right? So when we have passages like, look, you can beat them, and they use a wooden rod, that this is terrible. Yeah. But the problem is that this was sort of, as you read in Proverbs 13, and probably 4 or 5 other passages in the Proverbs, as Trent said, you do this to kids, right? So does it make it better? No, but it's part of the ancient context. And slavery, I think maybe likening it unto someone who has been a drug addict, and I'm not really well versed in this, so forgive me if I say this wrong, everybody watching, but like if somebody's doing a particular kind of drug and you're trying to get them off of it, you don't just cut them off. Maybe you give them like methadone or something to sort of, it's a step forward. It's not as bad as the drug that they were taking, but it's what they can handle, right? And as Hebrews, the meat of the word, not yet, got to stay on the milk. And so, this sort of progressive idea shows up in the biblical text. And so, when God condescends to humanity in the laws of the Old Testament, as we see in Matthew 19, he's not coming down and just cutting them off on everything, right? And saying, okay, this is what you have to do. He makes concessions, not because he wants to, not because it's his ideal, but it's his plan to move people along. And it's the sin that comes from the fall that keeps, that puts humanity in this position. And so as with divorce, where the people had hard hearts, and so they wanted to put their wives away, God regulated it in such a way that it wouldn't be as bad, but it still allowed more than he wanted. And it wasn't until like the New Testament when he sort of pulls the curtain back a little bit and says, hey, that was me letting you do more than I wanted you to do, but so that it was because of your hard-heartedness, but we're moving you forward. And so if that principle holds, then the argument would be that if we can go back and look at the laws about slavery in particular in the Hebrew Bible, and we see progressive things, maybe not progressive, like super progressive by our standards today, but more progressive than what was going on around them, then maybe that sort of provides further evidence for this progressive development, and God's trying to condescend and bring people along. So some of the places that we go are Deuteronomy 23, 15 to 16, or 16 to 17 in the Hebrew, where like everybody agrees this is something that doesn't show up, at least overtly, that we can demonstrate in the ancient Near East. There are many, many laws, and it's noteworthy. There are many laws in the ancient Near Eastern law collections that talk about what to do when slaves run away. Maybe you bring them back, you bring them back. And that does not appear in the Hebrew Bible. And so this seems to be a place where, even though it is foreign slaves that are escaping into Israel, there's this thing that makes somebody that knows the ancient Near Eastern law collections go, whoa, that's different. Also, it seems that in Exodus 21, 20 to 21 and 26 to 27, which were probably originally joined in the older versions of the Covenant Code, that this regulated the not a free person beating someone else's slave, because that's dealt with in some detail in the law collections of the ancient Near East. But this is regulating a master beating his own slave. And so that seems progressive as well. And so if we can see that sort of progressive move, however large or small, and we believe that Matthew 19 establishes a sort of principle, then slavery can kind of, fall under that category. And it would be the abolitionists utilizing the biblical texts ultimately that would end slavery in really ultimately in the world. Does that seem? What would you correct?
I'll just clarify one thing that's not a correction, though, because this is your steel man was great. I've been a part of dialogues where the steel man is attempted, but it's not really a steel man, and yours was great, so thank you.
Gavin, you should have seen when Pearl tried to steel man me when I was talking to her. Let's say that.
That can be very frustrating. But yeah, no, that was good. So you were really hitting on some of these themes that we've been getting at in terms of accommodation and incrementalism, and the principle of Matthew 19:8. One thing that I want to clarify that's not a fault at all of yours, but just something to kind of push into it as well, is this progression or development, and I think Trent and I will probably be similar here, though he can speak to this too, is an organic one. So it's not like God pulling back the curtain and saying, haha, here's something totally new you'd never heard of before. But the principles embedded are growing organically, so that Genesis 1 is at the start of it all. So part of the issue here is what a law is, and that we don't look to the laws as this is giving the ideal. The ideal is given in the creation text, where you have all people made in God's image. And that's another point of uniqueness that I argued in my first video, that the idea of in the image of God democratized to everyone as a unique idea in the ancient Near East. So that is in the background. So in other words, Jesus is not just introducing something totally radically new in Matthew 19:8. He's drawing from the best of what is already there, that's sort of organically unfolding throughout history. And you see that in the Job 31 text. How can I mistreat my servant since we have the same maker? The appeal there is to the doctrine of creation. There's an organic flowing out that's built in from the beginning, the seed to the tree. And right out of the gate, you've got Genesis 1, which is the start of it all. And so I'm just trying to clarify the nature of the progression is not arbitrary, but it's organic. Trent, what would you add on in terms of anything we can clarify at this point?
No, I thought it was a very good steel man. I think the only thing that to make the best position to explain this topic understandable to someone who is maybe critical of Christianity or the Bible is to really underscore that the word slavery, and although, if we steel man here, this would come up in how I would steel man your position, how when Christians talk about slavery, sometimes, people will identify that word with the conditions of the antebellum South. And Christians will do that to try to exaggerate the Bible in defense of it. And atheists will sometimes do that so that when the word slavery comes up, only that is presented. But I think if you propose other ancient situations like forcing a thief to labor to restore what he had stolen, or enslaving prisoners of war who have attacked you to rebuild part of the city, I think many people would be hesitant to say that, to treat that as some kind of an intrinsic evil like they would the transatlantic slave trade or something like that.
Yeah. So we can, unless you guys want to add on anything else, we can also try to steel man your position. I want to make sure we get to that.
That sounds great.
I can just
Sounds good, yeah.
I'll be pretty brief on my side. I'll just kind of, from the slides you said there, you went through some texts defining slavery, Exodus 21, Deuteronomy 15, I think it was, and then Leviticus 25. I think those will be texts we'll return to, as well as the Deuteronomy 23 and Exodus 21 texts that have already come in. Just basically kind of summarizing a lot of the information in those texts. And then there's the reference to the Law of Hammurabi 115 and 116. And I think the claim here is that there many, or maybe you'd say all, you can clarify on this point, of the protections that existed for Israelite slaves also existed in other ancient Near Eastern cultures. And I think kind of implicit here is maybe not a frustration, but just a understandable response to when some apologists overplay the differences between Israelite servanthood and other places in the antebellum South, for example, as though there were no protective laws in these places. And I think you're trying to point out there are parallels, at least to some degree or another, maybe fully all the way, maybe you'd say, but there are parallels in terms of protective laws for servants and slaves in other places. Law of Hammurabi 115 and 116 being one example. And then there's just an identification of the ways that slavery is bad, that Trent commented on some of these points: the physical discipline, the lower status, the exploitation of women. Those were some of the things I heard you mention. And then sometimes I'll repeat a question that you guys have said that I think is a fair question, and that's the therefore what question. So when slavery is mitigated to some degree, I think there's a concern that, well, yeah, okay, but it's still bad. And this will be an interesting discussion because, as I mentioned, your last sentence of your book, Josh, I think there actually isn't a complete disagreement on the first of the two things that Trent identified, namely just the empirical facts. There actually isn't a total disagreement about that, even though we disagree on the larger worldview implications. So those are a few comments. I'm sure I missed a few things. Maybe Trent can help me in terms of the Steelman here.
I think the only thing to Steelman that I think your guys' position is, it's not even necessarily a position about slavery in the Old Testament per se, but perhaps noticing something frustrating that Christians doing apologetics or presenting the Bible, when people bring up the issue of slavery as a defeater to try to show the Bible is not divinely inspired, Christians will not present slavery as it truly was. And so they may do things like pretend that all slavery was debt-based and temporary, or they will compare the laws of the Old Testament to the worst practices of the antebellum South, when you should really compare the laws in each case and the practices in each case to make a fair comparison. And just that in trying to present that the Christian faith is defensible, it's frustrating if let us look under the hood to see the car the way it really is. Don't tell us the way you think the car runs. Let's look under the hood and see the grime and see the car, and let's see if it is worth driving.
Yeah, and Kipp, I'll just make a couple of quick comments, and then you should go. Yeah, I mean, I think I don't remember what the last line of my book is, but I suspect it has something to do with like none of this like disproves Christianity, right, or the reality of Christianity. I suspect it's something like that. But
do you want to read it, Gavin?
I can read it if you want.
Oh yeah.
Okay, yeah. So well, let me start with the second to last sentence first to set the context. You say, I often say that it is not my intent to show that the God of the Old Testament is a big meanie or to characterize him as a type of moral monster. Okay, here's the last sentence. Instead, my hope is that the reader will view Old Testament slavery laws and the legal traditions with which they accord as a product of their cultural milieu, and that the morality that is seen in the biblical texts can be taken not as prescriptive laws that must be followed throughout human history, but as texts that described actual or theoretical practices in the ancient world. End of the book. And the reason I thought of that is, as everyone has heard, we are not arguing that they are prescriptive laws that must be followed throughout human history. And so that's where we have some degree of overlap in terms of just the empirical facts and even some of the implications for worldview. I'm not saying either Trent or I would sign off wholesale on this sentence, because we'd have to get into the definition of product of their cultural milieu and stuff like that. But there's agreement to this extent that, yeah, this is not a timeless ideal. And we would say, I think it was never intended to be.
Yeah. So I think that was a fair Steelman. I guess. Yeah. Well, Kipp, go ahead. Sorry, because I feel like I've talked.
No,
a lot. You go ahead.
I mean, honestly, the first thing, and this wasn't something that that really came up in our preparation for the discussion at all, but I did see someone post this in the chat, and I think it's certainly worthwhile clarifying right at the get-go, because I'm constantly surprised at how often this is a question that needs to be asked. But I'm just wondering if maybe we should start this part of the discussion with the question. I mean, are we all in agreement here that slavery is immoral?
You'd have to define what you mean by that term. Is it the term you used in your definition?
Do you want me to repeat the definition?
Well, it
I mean,
seemed like it was essentially the rights to control another person's labor. It's a total control. I'm trying to. I put some notes down here.
Shall I repeat it?
Is
If you'd like,
I can
sure.
read it. So
A condition in which
go ahead, Kipp.
a condition in which an individual or rights to their labor is owned by another, either temporarily or permanently. The owner controls and may benefit from the actions and activities of the owned individual.
Yeah, Trent can go on this. I mean, I would say this is where the definitions are so important, because
Right.
my basic position is that all forms of slavery or servanthood, to throw in another term just to really widen it, are a reflection of the fact that we live in a fallen world. None would exist if God's ideal intention at his creation obtained. But there are milder forms of what we might call servanthood or indentured servitude that are not necessarily immoral. I'll let Trent speak what he would speak on this.
Yeah, I would say that they are bad in the same way that pain and death are bad. But to say that something is immoral or wrong to do, the problem is how you move the definition. So, for example, the 13th Amendment of the Constitution of the United States says, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime, have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States. So what's interesting there is that even when slavery was abolished in the United States, that was left in as a caveat. You know, no slavery, no indentured servitude, except as legal punishment. Was that often abused? Absolutely. You know, in the American South during Reconstruction, absolutely abused. Yet at the same time, one could define a prisoner in the United States today, like the courts have ruled that prisoners who work and pick up trash on the side of the road, they're not entitled remuneration for what they do. That can be a part of them repaying their debt to society. So if you say slavery is immoral and you have a very broad definition of it, I worry that things that are fairly unobjectionable even today, and then going back to what I discussed about in the ancient world, like you have some ancient law codes. If someone's a thief, for example, the punishment for thievery is amputation of a limb or death. I would say forcing them to be in forced labor to someone is much more humane than amputating or killing them. So I am hesitant to say that. I think the term I would use to describe slavery would be, philosophers use the term a moral hazard. It is something that, while in very narrow circumstances can be moral, it's something we ought to do away with because it's very, very easy for it to become exploitative and immoral very quickly. So people can look up the literature on moral hazards, and that is something that has been, you know, discussed. So there can be things that in narrow circumstances are appropriate. Similar with the death penalty. The death penalty can be appropriate in a very, very, very narrow circumstance if it's the only thing that can protect society. But if you allow it, for many people argue, oh, but then it becomes abused, and that's why we can't have that. So I think when it comes to slavery, the term I would use, I guess I would use the term for it, I call it a moral hazard.
Would you guys say that voluntary indentured servitude is immoral?
I mean, I would, yeah.
What about a voluntary arrangement like that, if someone elects to be in that position, is immoral? Or could you flesh that out a little bit?
Well, I'm going to say no. I won't. I'll tell you why. This is sort of my trademark, right? Online, if I'm not a specialist in something, I tend to steer clear of it. So I want to answer your question. I may not have a good reason why I think rape is wrong, like philosophically or ethically, like some sort of ethical framework. I may not have that. I probably don't, right? But I start there. Is that consistent? Probably not, but it's where I am. So, but I'm okay with that. I sleep okay at night because I'm probably going with intuition pumps, and I'm going with I probably didn't even use that right, to tell you the truth, but you know,
You're just going with an intuition right now.
yeah. But the point is, or the reason that I really do want to make sure that we stay on target here, while I think this is an important topic for someone else to discuss, that's an ethicist, right? That works in that philosophical part of the philosophical field. What I think is more important in this context is that we agree on the definition first, right? Because that's where it feels like we're already getting hung up there.
Yeah.
Like that definition was curated quite meticulously when I put it in the book, and there's a reason for that, because you know there's a volume out from the Oriental Institute that Laura Culbertson edited, and that they, as everybody does, lament the difficulty in defining slavery, just the word slavery, in the ancient Near East, in the ancient world. Because, as you guys have pointed out in other places, like this term can apply to kings, Moses, right? Like these are Joshua, like these are, and it can apply to a chattel slave, right? So the problem is not being able to define it in a particular context. I think it's trying to coming up with an all-inclusive definition for the word run that would apply to every situation would probably be so general that it would lose any real use, right? Any real value. So I think maybe, and I'll be quiet, but maybe what we should do is we should go to some of these passages, because I think, for example, if we talk about owning another person as property, I think that's very easy to establish in the broader ancient Near East, in the Hebrew Bible. I think it's very easy to establish that. So maybe that's the direction we should go, or we can go a different direction, whatever you guys want to do.
I mean, I'm
good.
fine talking about that, but I do think it's important for people to consider. It's like the question, is slavery immoral? It's like the question, is factory farming immoral? It's not as simple as it first appears when you discuss, if you were to say, well, if you think factory farming is immoral, why do you eat a hamburger? Or why don't you petition a law to have them all shut down? Or, this and that. I also do think that, like the example I brought up earlier, it's hard. You're right. You have an intuition slavery is wrong, but I think a concrete example in the ancient world would be enslavement of a thief to give restitution of damages caused. I have a very strong intuition that's a very just thing to do. Even if we did something like that today, though, I think it would quickly become a moral hazard. But back in the ancient world, when you have very few options for securing the civil order, I see that would be a very humane treatment compared to other things that can be done to someone. But I do think that slavery was bad, like many other bad things that happened then. And the goal is to progressively move society away from things, slavery we could even compare to even just things like substandard working conditions in general. But Josh, yeah, we can talk about the passages if you want.
Yeah, I'm totally good with your proposal to. Sorry to throw that question at you, but yeah, let's go through the passages.
I think that was my question actually. But,
okay, yeah.
I think I started that. Sorry, guys.
All good, all good. Yeah, we can go through
Kipp,
the passages.
Are you from Canada, by the way?
Yeah, I'm in Canada right now, actually.
I was just gonna say, being Canadian means you never have to say you're sorry.
No, it's just. And yet
totally
somehow
fine.
we're always saying we're sorry. So yeah.
Well, do you want to start at Exodus 21, 2-6?
We can start wherever you guys want. That one I won't think we'll have necessarily a ton of disagreement on. In terms of the thesis on the table, we kind of framed the discussion as, did the Old Testament make improvements upon the ancient Near East? So I've not proposed that particular passage is an improvement. So supposing whatever you wanted to work through there, it may not even be relevant to the framed nub of disagreement. But we can talk about it if you want.
it's one of the places that I think gets missed in the discussion because the main figure in the law is the guy, right? But the wife that he's given and the children that they have sort of pass unnoticed quite often. And the status that the man takes when he agrees to because he wants to stay with them, they're all chattel slavery, right? They're all permanent slavery. Like that he's no longer a debt slave. She was never a debt slave. The child was never a debt slave. And so like that's an important aspect of the passage that I think, because we focus so much on the guy, right? And he's a debt slave. He voluntarily does this, maybe under duress, but and then he agrees because he loves his master. Like that's sort of how that's usually put forward. But I think it pushes into the background the chattel slavery aspects of that passage.
Well, should you read the passage, and then we might have a question about what you mean by chattel, because I think sometimes we might have a different vocabulary to use about the main differences. Sure. You can go ahead.
Yeah. So I'll just say chattel means they're owned as property, right? Chattel slavery is slavery that is generally permanent. The person becomes the property of the master. Now there are different. There are different.
Well, I guess my question is: were temporary debt slaves the property of the person they were enslaved to while the debt was present?
No. Well, no, not in the sense that I'm saying, because they're not considered alienable, right? So pledges, distraints, any kind of a debt slave is considered to be essentially still a free person, ultimately, because they're going to go back to that free status. So that's why there are restrictions on the way that you can treat them physically, and you can't sell them because they're not alienable property. But once somebody takes up permanent slavery, where there's no debt to be repaid, there's no required manumission, then that person sort of steps into that property status. Now, again, there's nuance to that. But yeah,
I think the language we would probably would use when talking about this would just be temporary versus permanent slavery. That the difference here is the jurisdiction of the one who has ownership and the length of time of the servitude. Whereas we would say, and Gavin, always chime in when you like, that there's not dramatic differences in the types of behaviors you can engage in, at least with male slaves. So female slaves are going to be different. That what I concern is that when you say something like slaves were property, like when we think of property today, like I've got my table is my property. I can chop it up to make firewood because it's my property. I can do what I want with it. But our contention is that the Old Testament slavery laws, both for temporary and permanent slaves, one could not treat them like you could treat an animal. Like an ox, he could do agricultural work or you could slaughter for food. Didn't matter. But you couldn't do that with them. Go ahead.
So just so it's clear, like if that's the case, then under the law in the antebellum South, they weren't chattel slaves either.
Right, and I wouldn't argue that. Like you said, compare law to law and practice to practice.
So I think like maybe for the audience, like, and I think we would all agree that they were owned as property, but there were laws restricting. You couldn't, according to the law, today, you weren't allowed to. Yeah, you weren't allowed to abuse your slave. You weren't allowed to murder your slave, even though they did. Right? That's not debated. It was
I think it's and the same holds today too, right? We can't just do whatever we want with whatever we own. I'm not allowed to abuse my pets. I'm not allowed to burn down my house. I'm not allowed to run people over with my car. So like it I don't like the distinction of property means you can do whatever you want
Right.
with whatever you own.
Well, I think there's a broader latitude. And also my concern is when we talk about, well, chattel slaves were property, realistically speaking, when we're discussing authority structures in the ancient Near East, if you were a male with authority, those under you, children, your free wife, they could be grouped under the heading of property. Like in the 10 Commandments, it says, you shall not covet your neighbor's wife, your neighbor's house, your neighbor's oxen, your neighbor's maidservants, manservants. They all get kind of listed there. And the husband had much more authority over the wife that almost you could, I mean, I don't know. I think you would say probably the ancient Near East, the wife was considered the husband's property.
But I think that making that comparison sort of serves our point, because the reason that I hear that most of the time is that people say, well, like you could beat your son, and so you love your son, and so you must like love your slave. In other words, it's the comparison is meant to pull the slave up closer to the family, what we consider to be family, rather than the family down closer to the status of slave, right? Like, and so I think that comparison, which you said, serves to sort of solidify the point of what slavery was like, because I think in other words, it doesn't pull slavery up to a better position. It brings the position of other family members down compared to what we think of family members today. Did that make sense?
Yeah, I can see that.
Sense.
And Gavin, I don't know if you have, I don't want to keep monopolizing the time of a bad habit of doing that. But I do think looking at a spectrum that for the Israelites, for those in the Hebrew Bible, that you see their ethic of treating other human beings, it's very different than how you would look at like an animal, for example, or even how other societies at the time treated their slaves. And I think that's what Gavin and I, the biggest points we wanted to raise, and I'm fine talking about this beginning passage, but the biggest thing there is that you could be legally punished for harming your own slave. Not for you could have, you could abuse your animal. The Bible even only talks about being kind, to pick up other people's animals if they're burdened or something like that. But you could not abuse a slave that you owned. You could not cause serious injury beyond disciplinary injury. So permanent serious injury.
Well, let's go to that.
Go ahead.
Because it sounds like that's a good place to go. So if we could pull Exodus 21, 20 to 21, and 26, 27 up, or just that
And
part
if
of
I could
Exodus
just make
21.
a comment to kind of that will
Please.
transition us to that as well, and this will just follow up on what you said, because actually, and maybe this will take us to Exodus 21, but this can be a concession to you, Josh, in that a lot of this is terminology. Okay, I would concede that there's ownership. So if that's what chattel slavery means, then yeah, we can use that term. I don't like doing that because I think that has associations for modern people that are very misleading. It brings up other conceptions of other kinds of chattel slavery in which there's a perception of a lack of human equality between the slave and the master.
Yeah.
And that isn't a reflection of how it was in ancient Israel.
For example, in ancient Rome, before the Reformation, the reforms of Emperor Antonius Pius, you could kill your own slave. It wasn't until the middle of the 2nd century after Christ that legislation was passed to prevent people from doing that. So Roman slavery was even like beyond more than some of the things you see in Israelite slavery.
So when you have the Job 31 text, the whole rationale, he's saying, and I know that Job was not an Israelite, but this is a text that's incorporated into the Hebrew canon that reflects values that were recognizable to them. The whole logic is I can't mistreat my servant because we have the same maker. And there's if you look at how even the foreign slaves, which I know we're not even talking about with Exodus 21, 2-6, You have intermarriage between the foreign slave and an Israelite. You see that with Jarha in 1 Chronicles 2. You have foreign slaves that are serving in the royal court. There's not a perception of inherent Israelite superiority on the basis of race or anything else. One of the recurrent motifs throughout the Pentateuch, if there's anything that comes through in the Hebrew Bible, those first 5 books, it's I think it's over 36 times. Show compassion for the sojourner among you, for that is what you were in Egypt. And then I would say, in addition to that, I'm trying to state the reasons why I'm uncomfortable with the term chattel because of its associations. The Hebrew servants, if you say they're property or chattel, nonetheless, it functions so differently from other forms of chattel slavery that I'm just worried about an equivocation with that term where people get the wrong idea. Because Hebrew servants, we're going to argue, had significantly greater rights than other forms of chattel slavery. They had the Sabbath rest principle. They had protection from physical harm, which we'll argue in a moment from verses 26 and 27. There were the gleaning laws. There was participation in rituals like the Passover. So you have basically a system where I'm worried if that term is used, someone is going to get the wrong idea by associating this with what, for example, the despicable practices in our own nation's history as one example, when there are real differences that are worth exploring. And what I would say, and I think Trent would say, is some of these differences are not negligible. You know, the protection against physical abuse, that the master cannot harm his own servant. That really was I would say, a counterbalance to the prevailing wind of thought in the ancient Near East that I would say was a domino that had historical consequences. So, Josh, I see you want to jump in. Go
Yes,
ahead.
sorry. So let's go to it because I fundamentally disagree with you, and that's I guess that's expected. But maybe somebody want to read? I mean,
Why don't I read it and I'll make the
Start.
case, and then I'll just let you respond and say where you disagree. And in making this case, I won't say anything new that you haven't already heard. So you can just, you've already heard all this in my videos. And if Trent wants to comment, feel free to jump in too. But Exodus 21, 26 to 27, when a man strikes the eye of his slave, male or female, and destroys it, he shall let the slave go free because of his eye. If he knocks out the tooth of his slave, male or female, he shall let the slave go free because of his tooth. Now, what I pointed out is that I am not alone in observing that this looks like a unique law. In my follow-up video to you guys, I read through a bunch of Appendix 2. I read through other parts of this book looking for something parallel to that. I quoted Nahum Sarna, who says, quote, "This law, the protection of slaves from maltreatment by their masters, is found nowhere else in the entire existing corpus of ancient Near Eastern legislation." I quoted Chris Wright, who says, "No other ancient Near Eastern law has been found that holds a master to account for the treatment of his own slaves, as distinct from injury done to the slave of another master." I quoted from the Anchor Bible Dictionary, which says, "We have in the Bible the first appeals in world literature to treat slaves as human beings for their own sake and not just in the interest of their masters." And then I have a longer quote from Walter Eichrodt saying the same thing. I won't read it for the sake of time. And basically, I'll just be brief, give you lots of time. But the law of Hammurabi 116 just seems to me a completely different scenario. It's talking about death, not physical mistreatment. It has reference to prison or some other circumstance in which the death occurs. And most significantly, it's a third party injuring a servant or slave and then paying the master. So that law is designed to protect the rights of the power party in the relationship, the master. Exodus 21 is just in the opposite direction. It seems that it's protecting the welfare of the slave. There's a difference between saying if you mistreat someone else's slave, you pay that master, versus saying the master himself can't mistreat his own slave. And I'm open to changing my mind. You guys are Old Testament scholars. I am not, but I just can't see any other law that I've seen thus far in the discussion that actually is a parallel to that specific circumstance. So Trent, if you want to add on, and then you guys can respond.
No, that sums it up.
So let's take Exodus 21 as it stands first. So this is almost universally agreed by subject matter experts in the field that this is describing debt slavery. So these are debt slaves. This is why there are things like, let him go free without repayment of debt. Like these are debt slaves.
Well, I would
So,
just register that is where we differ. I quoted Jay Sklar's commentary, who says this is not referring to only
yeah,
dead
I know.
slaves. So that's just
I
I'm
know.
just pointing out
Basing
it's
that
not
on
Yeah,
universal. There's other
like
perspectives on that.
what's the rationale for that?
Well, there
Yeah,
is
that's
absolutely no qualification of one kind of slave versus another in those verses. That's just read into the text, as far as I can tell.
I mean,
I don't see anything in those verses that says this is a debt slave. It just says it's a slave.
okay. So yeah, Gregory Kirikino in like 93, and I think you looked at his book, had a huge discussion on this, right? So I mean, I don't know if we want to go into the nuances of that here, but I mean, I suppose that we can. A lot of this centers around what it is that the entire passage in Exodus 21 is doing. Right, it's Exodus 21, 2-6 clearly starts off with Israelite debt slavery. The fact that we're letting the individual that there's no punishment. Sorry, let me do this differently. The real important part of Laws of Hammurabi 115 and 116, which I'll just read real quick here. If a man has a claim of grain or silver against another man, distrains a member of his household, and the distrainee dies a natural death while in the house of his or her distrainer, that case has no basis for a claim. If the distrainee should die from the effects of a beating or other physical abuse while in the house of his or her distrainer, the owner of the distrainee shall charge and convict his merchant. And if the distrainee is the man's son, they shall kill the distrainer's son. If a man's slave, he shall weigh and deliver 20 shekels of silver. He shall forfeit whatever he originally gave as the loan. So the parallel here, the only reason I'll read something that Bernard Jackson wrote in his tome on the wisdom laws, the Mishpatim there in the Covenant Code. He says, commentators have often remarked that the protection here gives the slaves against their own masters is exceptional. The ancient Near Eastern collections, they claim, provide only for assaults on the slaves of others and leave unregulated and thus unrestricted assaults committed by a master on his own slaves. Biblical law is claimed to display a higher moral standard in protecting the slave even against his own master, but this is a false comparison. Debt slavery is protected in some of the ancient Near Eastern collections. The false comparison has resulted from the fact that the latter, the ancient Near Eastern law collections, use the terminology of niputum, which is the Akkadian word for like distraint, right? Referring to the unilateral seizure of a debt slave, sometimes legally, sometimes illegally, by the creditor, rather than the semantic equivalence of evid and ama, which would be like wardum and wardum. So the point of Exodus, making this comparison between Laws of Hammurabi 115 and 116 is to show that they are comparable not to 26 and 27, but to 20 and 21. And this is sort of the rationale that bears out. It's why this phrase at the end of 21 is so problematic for scholars. Kikas pohu, right? Because he is his silver. It's problematic because it looks like it's being the text is being amended to try to make it into chattel slavery because he is his silver, right? But the point here, the reason that scholars come down on this is because there's this sort of clear comparison in not only legal rationale. Bruce Wells writes about this, and I'll be quiet after this. Sorry, but it's because there's this. I mean, it's clear in Laws of Hammurabi, right? If you beat a debt slave, that's not yours, right? It's a distraint. It's somebody that's standing in as a debt slave. The law of retaliation, lex talionis, comes in, right? It's the same setup. And so there are other little cues like this. The fact that the slave is set free in 26 and 27, is perfectly consistent with somebody who is a debt slave or a distraint or a pledge. That's why most scholars come down on that. that it's a debt slave. It's one of the reasons.
Would you
Go ahead.
agree, though, there is no law in the ancient Near East collection that commands a slave to be released if they are seriously injured?
Yeah, I don't know of anything off the top of my head.
But that kind of law does exist in the Old Testament.
Right, but it's not something that's inconsistent with the rationale of not only of the passage, but of what's going on in the laws of Hammurabi. So if you think about the way that Exodus 21 is set up, you have murderous or not murderous, you have homicide to a free man, then damage to a free man. Then you have homicide to a slave. That's why they think 22 to 25 is probably something that's later inserted. Then you have damage to a slave. If this is a debt slave, this is precisely consistent with what we see in the laws of Hammurabi. And it's unsurprising, honestly, that the law collections wouldn't talk about that, because I take the position, for the most part, I'm not a legal specialist, so I don't want to come down hard on that. But I suspect, I'll say it that way, I suspect that the law collections are not normative legislation, right? I don't think they're a code that's trying to set out all the different possibilities of something that, could happen. So anyway, but yes, I agree with you that there isn't something like that.
Because in Law of Hammurabi 116, we have the slave has died because of what the distrainer has done. So to remedy the harm that was caused, 1/3 a mina of gold has to be given to the merchant or to whoever. Even though I'd still say this third party makes it different. So what's interesting here, we're looking at there usually in a law there's a harm. How do you give restitution for the harm? And here, but the only harm that's considered is that if the slave dies because of something somebody did, then money has to be given to make up for that fact. But the Old Testament seems unique in that because the slave has been seriously injured, the restitution there doesn't seem to have anything to do with the master. It seems to, the only explanation would have to be that it's something to do with the slave, which we don't see in Hammurabi.
Yeah, can we put the verses back up? Because I'll show you why I don't think that's the case. If you scroll down to the bull goring incident, 28 to 32, I won't read the whole thing. I mean, I can, I guess, but all right, I'll just do it. If a bull gores a man or a woman to death, the bull is to be stoned to death, and that meat must not be eaten, but the owner of the bull will not be held responsible. If, however, the bull has had the habit of goring, and the owner has been warned, so we're talking about a law about negligence here, but has not kept it penned up, and it kills a man or a woman, the bull is to be stoned, and the owner is to be put to death. So here we have free man, free woman, right? Citizen, they get killed because this guy was negligent, owner gets killed. However, if payment is demanded, the owner may redeem his life by the payment of whatever is demanded. So this is part of lex talionis in general.
Right.
This law also applies if the bull gores a son or daughter. So again, free individuals. If the bull gores a male or female slave, the owner must pay 30 shekels of silver to the master of the slave, and the bull is to be stoned to death. This is property law.
And where I would disagree is I would say that in the ancient Near East, we also have to be careful that it's not just, there's free people and then there's people that are property. You have a wide array of social classes that are technically free, and there's going to be different punishments among them. Like if you look in Law of Hammurabi, you have the people at the highest. Among free people, you have the Awilu, but then below them you have the Muskanu. They're free, but they're middle class. They're not like Awilu, and they get treated differently in the law. And then you have the Wardu, so you have the slaves at the bottom. And this is, so I would say the fact that slaves are of a lower social class condition, and so punishments for them are lighter than someone who is higher in the social class, I don't think that means that it's just that simple person property dichotomy, because even among free persons, you could have very light punishments for someone who is a free person, but just of a very low social status.
Right, but this is the fundamental distinction, right? People, when they talk about the covenant code, when they talk about the biblical laws, they say, "See, look at Hammurabi. You got classes, not in the Bible." But what I'm demonstrating here, I think, and again, this is just sort of consensus scholarship on this. I'm not saying anything that's outside of the norm here. The fact that property law takes over in 28 to 32 with the bull goring, there's a clear distinction between the penalty for that ox goring and I don't even like the word free because I don't think it applies, but that's the best that I can come up with. I actually don't. Anyway, we're going to say free. A citizen, how about that? An Ezrach, right? A citizen that is not in a position of slavery or servitude. How about that? That penalty is paid to that individual or to the person. Like if it's a wife, then it's the husband of that. If it's a son or daughter, it's the parents, probably the father here. But for the slave, the payment is not made, or there is no lex talionis. There's no lex talionis. And that's the other thing that maybe, I don't know. That's the other thing that's telling about Exodus 21, 26 to 27, is the slave is not due lex talionis. Yeah. That's key.
I would respond by conceding a lot of the comments you're making there, Josh, but I don't see. So again, the framing of disagreement is significant improvement in the Hebrew Bible over and against the ancient Near East. It sounds like, if I could summarize, we're agreeing on the uniqueness of Exodus 21, 26 to 27. This is a unique, unheard of law at that time in that place, that the master cannot harm his own slave, but we're disagreeing on the implications of that and how to interpret that more broadly. One thing I want to parenthetically insert, I see you want to jump in. Go ahead first.
All right. I would not say that. What I would say, it's unique in that there isn't another law in the collections that presents that. I don't think that this is some like radically different legal rationale in the same way that I wouldn't be surprised in the slave.
I didn't say the rationale is unique. I just said the law is unique.
Okay, as long as that's all we're saying is that it appears here and it doesn't appear elsewhere.
Yeah, again, we agree that the law is unique. We disagree on the implications of that uniqueness for the larger world.
And what's unique is that if a slave is seriously injured, they must be released. And in that particular instance is not found in the other law codes.
And seriously injured by their own master.
By their own master, intentionally.
And just the parenthetical thing for viewers, real quick, then you go, Kipp, is that this is case law. It's not saying you can't knock out the tooth or the eye, but every other part of the body is fair game. In my last clip, I referenced Ken Stewart's quote where he's basically saying this is representative of physical abuse to the slave. I just wanted to insert that for viewers. Go ahead, Kipp.
Yeah, no, so I mean, one of the problems with discussions like this is that the law codes, all the ancient Near Eastern law codes, are not always in conversation with one another, right? So while you have this particular unique element within the Hebrew law code, there are unique elements in other law codes that are not addressed by the Hebrew Bible. For example, there's no provision, as far as I know, in the Hebrew Bible for slaves to challenge their status. Am I correct about that, Josh?
I don't know of anything off the top of my head.
But we have other ancient Near Eastern law codes where this is something that happens.
Yeah.
Right? So are we prepared to say then, on that point, these are progressive beyond what's in the Hebrew Bible, where there's no provision for a slave to challenge a slave to challenge his status?
You mean just to claim that he's I'm not actually a slave? Because there are people, like we just read one where a slave wants to change his status.
No, it's when they say, I have served you. It's a debt slave saying, I have served you this sufficient amount of time, and the master saying, I'm not letting you go because you haven't. He can take his master to court.
Yeah, I would concede other points, speaking for myself, where you can find a law in another ancient Near Eastern text that isn't in the Bible. So, I'm not going to try to say it's The Bible always wins in every single scenario. But I would
So-
say that I wouldn't agree to this point, because Job 31, the scenario envisaged is the servant brings a case against his master. And that's what Job is saying. I can't mistreat him, because when he brings that case against me, he can make an appeal. We have the same creator.
This brings up, I think, oh, go ahead, Kipp. Sorry.
No, you go.
This brings up, I guess, a broader point for me. In this sort of progressive or incremental movement view, how many counterexamples does it take for it to not work in your minds? In other words, if I could show you a case, a pretty clear case, where an ancient Near Eastern law collection seems to be better, and the Hebrew Bible makes it worse, what would that mean, if anything?
Yeah, it would tip the scales, right? So then we're weighing. This is where I think I said at the last at the end of my last response to you. We can get into this and do the question of extent. The claim on the table is significant improvements. Okay, so then we can double click on the word significant and unpack that and see, well, how significant is it? Just a little significant? And we can kind of weigh the scales on the pros and cons. The two that I've put forward, Deuteronomy 23, Exodus 21, they're very significant because of the implications of what's at stake. I agree with what I'm reading, and you guys are Old Testament scholars, I'm not. But what I'm reading in the Old Testament scholarship is a pretty significant recognition that it is a big deal to have a law that says the master cannot physically abuse the slave. And so the nature of, so I guess to answer your question, it comes down to the nature of the uniqueness, and then we're looking at it in both directions.
I'd also say challenging one's status. I mean, Exodus also prohibits kidnapping. So one would think that part of convicting someone of kidnapping is compiling evidence that no, this person actually is not his slave. He does not have rights to them. Other family members or clan could testify to that. But it would seem to fall into that the person himself could make that testimony.
Yeah, but all the other ancient Near Eastern law codes have laws against kidnapping as well.
Right. I'm not
I mean,
saying that's you. I'm not saying that it's unique. I'm just saying that
I think he's
that it's not like the Old Testament code. It's like that different from the other codes. And like, oh, well, they can challenge their status to the master. It seems like that's bubbled up a little bit within some of the stuff in Exodus.
It just, the reason that I asked that question is this seems very like it could, if the premise here is that God is moving, like making regulations to make slavery a little bit better, it seems really problematic if he makes some of it worse. Like, what would be the rationale for him making it worse?
Well, I don't think you've given an example yet of it being made worse. Just one example it's missing legislation that could make it better, like challenging.
In the laws of Hammurabi 117, right? Debt slavery, you can only keep a debt slave for 3 years, right? They have to be released in the fourth. In both Exodus 21 and Deuteronomy 15, it's 6 years. So, so then the question would be, is it better or worse to serve as a slave for longer?
Well, Gavin may have some thoughts on this. I don't know. I have a thought on this. The answer is it depends. So John Goldingay is an Old Testament scholar, and some of his thoughts on the difference there, that it may be the case that it's harsher but more realistic. So on the face of it, it does seem worse to say that the debt bondage is 6 years instead of 3 years. But imagine you passed a law saying that people that forgive the strained analogy with the best we can do in the modern world, that there's a lot of people in mortgage debt slavery. I got a Fannie Mae, I got to pay my mortgage, and it's just a lot to deal with. What if we passed a law is saying that we're capping mortgages at 15 years instead of 30 years to alleviate people and not have them be under that burden so much? One could say that that's better for people, unless there's unintended consequences, like, for example, the mortgage it's more onerous to undertake, or people aren't as willing to take out loan. Banks are not as willing to offer the loans because they're riskier and they don't know if they'll get paid back. And the comparison there would be, it may be a case that the Hebrew length is longer, because if you shorten the debt slave, why not, instead of 3 years, why not 1 year? Why not half a year? Well, suddenly a master may be hesitant to want to take on someone who wants to sell themselves into debt slavery because their crops failed, they have nothing, and the people who can take on debt slaves may say, well, I'm worried in this short amount of time, maybe I'll get repaid, maybe I won't through their labor. And so if you shorten it enough, it's about a balancing act between those who will seek out relief through something like debt slavery and those willing to take on the risk of housing and providing for someone in this sort of servitude, while also trying to get back the same amount of value in labor. So I think that is something that some scholars have considered in seeing the difference between the two.
So two big problems that I see with it. One, it wouldn't factor in at all in Deuteronomy 15, right? Because Deuteronomy 15, you serve for 6 years, but then you're supposed to give them tons of stuff, right? To the point that the master, like the law envisions the master going, what? Like, how am I going to do that? That's not economically viable. And God has to say, I will supernaturally, I will bless you, right? Mm-hmm. I'll take care of it. It's the same sort of idea in Leviticus 25. So that's the first problem. I don't see that as a factor really at all. I think that Deuteronomy 25 is just taking the 6 year, Deuteronomy 15 is just taking the 6 year that it sees in the covenant code in Exodus 21 and saying, okay, yeah, sure, 6 years, but then you got to give them a bunch of stuff.
Now in law of Hammurabi 117, after the third year, you just have to release them. You don't have to give them anything.
That's correct. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So a master might need more time. And they may say, look, because you've had more time with this person. And also that is a part of Deuteronomy, that Deuteronomy is called the second law, to mitigate and help to, make these laws better in their application, to say because you've had them for so long, you have accrued wealth through this person's labor. This is what you have to do in return. But I don't know if Gavin, if you had any thoughts.
No, I'm not going to have a ton of. I mean, we're fairly in the weeds a little bit, already with this like 6 year versus 3 year vetting. What are the factors that make this good versus bad? I have to confess, Josh, I'm trying to move toward you here and see this from your point of view. I can kind of understand where you're coming from on this, and I don't necessarily have a lot of thoughts. I don't have enough knowledge about the law of Hammurabi versus this to really have a super informed judgment about that specific point at this. I think Trent's comments there were really helpful but I think just stepping back from that particular, I guess the bigger picture here for me, just trying to be really like completely honest, setting my heart on the table for why I wouldn't look at that and say, God is really making things worse in Israel or something like that, is because I just have I have a huge appreciation for how laws in any society actually are not that's not where we look to get the ideal. This isn't where we look to say, and that's been informed by Matthew 19:8, but it's also informed by Genesis 1 and the uniqueness there. And I would say, I think all of us are in agreement that the worst things we see in slavery are things we all want to oppose. This is terrible. We all want to affirm human dignity and human equality. For me, the Hebrew Bible, you have to read it as a whole, and it really is problematic if and this is, I'm just saying this, we can go back to the 6 years versus 3 years if you want, but I'm trying to sort of just be really candid with you in terms of how I think this through as a non-specialist on that specific point. You have to read the whole Bible in its context, and if you just pluck out the laws, that's not actually giving you the big banner over it all.
But Gavin, that's what you're doing, right? That's why I'm doing this, is because you guys are pulling, because you guys are pulling out Exodus 21, 20, 21, and 26, 27, holding it up and saying, see, it's better than the other ones. And what I'm saying is, okay.
The banner, when I say the big banner, I mean like the ultimate worldview of these people, and then the question of what is God's intent for them. It's true, we can single out one verse to make a particular point. So I single out Exodus 21, 26 to 27, Deuteronomy 23. I see those as very significant differences. And I think I would see those as way more significant than mere time of service. The quality of service, the protection of physical abuse is significant. And then the Deuteronomy 23 passage, which I think we should, if we have time to cover that one, that might be helpful. If this law is instantiated, it makes the nation of Israel a safe haven for runaway slaves in that region. And the rationale for that law, which is unprecedented anywhere else, is for the good of that person. You shall not harm him. And when I hear those last 5 words, you shall not harm this foreign runaway slave, I read that in light of what I see as the motif of all of these books, and that is this concern for the welfare of the servant. I see
And my
Trent's
quick
got a comment
addendum
on
onto that, like what Kipp mentioned earlier, like, well, in the Old Testament, there's no provision to challenge your status. That's true. But in the Old Testament, there also aren't any commandments to return fugitive slaves, which is very interesting that in Law of Hammurabi and these other codes, you can be punished for harboring slaves, commanded to return them, required to compensate those who return slaves. There's nothing like that in the Old Testament. So it's interesting is the Israelites, they don't seem to be as concerned about, when about the problem of runaway slaves needing to be returned.
In fact,
Okay.
they're commanded not to return them.
Okay, so let me say a couple of things, and then Kipp, sorry, I feel like I'm just hogging this mic, man. So the reason that I'm singling out Law of Hammurabi 117 with the 3 years as opposed to 6 is because it's in response to you guys singling out 26 and 27
Sure.
and doing this comparison, right?
Fair enough.
If you're asking me, I say, I mean, look, I'm with. Let me read a very short quote here by Bernard Jackson on this topic. There is, I think, a salutary lesson to be learned from this comparison, and it's the one that we were just talking about. It is all too easy to allow apologetics to enter into the comparison of biblical with ancient Near Eastern law. Apologetics, which take the form of showing the moral superiority of the biblical to the non-biblical collections. I do not, in this case, attribute such motivation to the claim. Sorry, he's talking about that there. But even if we do take the Exodus provisions as referring to slavery in general, the comparison does not lead in a single direction. Biblical law, making these assumptions, may give a protection to the permanent slave, which is absent in the ancient Near Eastern collections. But conversely, the protection from maltreatment according to the debt slave is greater in Hammurabi than it is in the Bible. The latter comparison, we may note, is consistent with the shorter maximum period of service for the debt slave, which Hammurabi sets at 3 years as opposed to the biblical 6. So, like, the reason that what Jackson would say, I think, I think I can speak fairly for him here, is he would say, yeah, I mean, like, some are better, some are worse, like by our modern standards. Yeah, I mean, it's why I say it's like fundamentally they're all sort of on the same par. They're all on par with one another, right? The same is true with like rape and adultery laws in the Hebrew Bible. That, like, I have a chapter on this. Like, they're just right on par with what you see in the ancient Near East. This is sort of what scholars like Ray Westbrook and Bruce Wells, this is what they talk about.
Yeah, good.
Oh,
Sorry.
No, it's okay. I was gonna go on to Deuteronomy 23, but if you wanted to comment on that, please go ahead.
No, I think that your objection, I think, has merit to it. I think here's where the difficulty will lie. I think we can make easy judgments on what society was more humane when it came to slavery, America in 2024 or 1824. Like, it's very easy to make that judgment right there. But then, like, a question that could be posed to both of you might be, in this particular window of the ancient Near East in this time period, when you look at the laws, like, if you had to make a judgment, was there a set of laws that were more humane than others, or, like, would you just say, well, they were all about equal, just some had perks here, others had perks there, but it's all kind of a wash in the end?
It's a good question.
Kipp, you want to go first? Yeah.
So I think on that question, now I have a couple of thoughts here. In the first place, I would say that there are often, I guess I see many of, and this is part of the problem. Much of the biblical legislation on these sorts of things tends to be vague enough that we're in this debate, right?
Mhm.
And I think for that reason, it's problematic. And I tend to go in the direction that it's more of the same across the board. Like it just the Hebrew Bible legislation, the various legislations look to me just as reflections of the period and the region. I don't see dramatic improvement. It's it's what I would expect of just people, sorting out their own legislation based on what
you don't
and
think
but
that the sorry, go ahead.
I've got one other thing to say here
Go
though
ahead.
too. So one of the other problems here is that we're not talking about and this is from a scholarly perspective. What tends to happen is we have to treat these texts not univocally, but we have to take a look and see where they came from. And in that respect, then you say, yeah, the laws in Deuteronomy are clearly written in response to stuff that's taking place in the covenant code. You brought up the legislation in Deuteronomy 23, which provides clarification or extra provision to what takes place in Exodus 21. So in that respect, I guess it would depend on which law code you're talking about and which time
He means
period.
15.
Sorry,
Yeah.
I did mean 15. And which time period you're talking about, because one of the problems with the quote unquote biblical laws is that there's a pretty dramatically complex period and of development here in terms of the material that makes the question more difficult. Yeah, Josh.
Yeah, I mean, I think when you this idea of the lack of univocality, right? I mean, we have different law collections, right? And so when you look at comparing something like the covenant code in Exodus 21 to the developments in Deuteronomy 15, and I think ultimately in Leviticus 25,
Mm-hmm.
there's a key feature that seems to show up pretty strongly in both of those latter passages, and that is supernatural provision. Right? So what Yahweh is saying is like, I want you to give significant provisions. How's that going to work? I'm going to supernaturally provide. And in that sense, absolutely. Like if that were actually going to happen, that's where I'd want to go, right? Like, there's just no question. And the same is as an Israelite, right? Now you could make the argument, and maybe I should think about this a little bit more before I go saying that. Not that that has any like real danger of happening, but like somebody could argue that I'd rather just serve for 3 years and go out with nothing than have to serve for 6 years and go out with a bunch of grain and wine and stuff. But at any rate, but Leviticus 25 is in the same principle, right? The whole chapter is about let the land lie fallow for a whole year, right? Every 7th year, let it lie fallow. Don't work. How are we going to do that, God? But don't worry. If you do it, I'm going to bless you, right? I'm going to come in supernaturally and give you so much that you're going to have to push out the old stock, right, to get the new stuff in.
Well,
And
that actually makes sorry, I don't want to interrupt, but
no, go ahead.
When we talk about whether something is humane, that actually brings up an interesting question. Is it because what we think is humane would have been very, very different from the people living in that time, so radically different. So, for example, what's very instructive is the episode in the Old Testament when David's daughter Tamar is raped by Absalom, and I'm trying to remember the verse here, but she says something to the effect of, please marry me, or that if you abandon me now, that will be worse than what you have already done, for example. that the abandonment would be considered worse than the sexual violation. Whereas today we would we have a hard time wrapping our heads around something like that. So yeah, if you get in your mind of someone who lives hand to mouth, subsistence farming in cruel conditions, just the way life was, would they rather have something that's 3 years with the greater possibility of abuse because serious injury is not prosecuted, or 6 years and you have those protections, and then you have the provision, though that is a little bit later in Deuteronomy. So yeah, I think when we talk about whether it's humane, we have to be careful about our perspective or their perspective.
I mean, I do want to push back on
Go
that.
ahead, Josh, then I'll go after you.
Just for a second. Like, I don't think that we can say that there were no provisions for serious injuries in like the laws of Hammurabi. Just because there's no law there doesn't mean that it wasn't some, because I think we have very clear precedent for that in 115 and 116, right? The debt slave is, and this is true in Middle Assyrian laws, right? When somebody switches from pledge to chattel, that's when they can be branded. That's when they can, have the which is the same in the Hebrew Bible, right? That's why in Exodus 21:5 or 6,
the awl in your ear,
the awl goes through the ear, right? I mean, this is a mark of chattel slavery. So, like, I do not concede that. Just so it's clear. But yeah, go ahead, Gavin.
No, that's cool. It's helpful. We're just clarifying disagreements and drilling into where the disagreements lie, and then the conversation goes forward. We keep talking. So it sounds like we're agreeing on some uniqueness in each direction. We're disagreeing on what that sort of entails for the comparative evaluation. So for me, the Exodus 21, 26 to 27 and the Deuteronomy 15 protection, basically saying no physical abuse to the slave, and you should not send back the runaway foreign slave. Rather, you shall not harm him, make provision for him. But those are not the only two. So just to be clear, when we're tipping the scales like this of what's better and worse, the behemoth is Genesis 1, which says every single human being is made in the image of God. Whereas I've only found one other Egyptian text that has that kind of categorization more broadly, and even then it's not for everyone. But almost in all the other examples, and in my initial video I put a lot out on this, it's that kind of classification is only for the royal figures. And I would say the reason this is not a negligible difference between Israelite culture and the other ancient Near Eastern cultures is its historical consequence. I know we don't want to get out of the Old Testament too much, but I need to say that Genesis 1 has done so much to get us to where we are today. This, and if I could just finish it with like two sentences, this was the hammer in the hand of the abolitionists. Everyone is made in the image of God. Because of its historical consequence, I think that lends credibility to the fact that this is a unique contribution that the Old Testament made to the world.
Right. There was a Mesopotamian proverb, real fast. Stephen Bertman, his book, Handbook to Life in Ancient Mesopotamia, published by Oxford University Press. A common proverb at the time was, man is the shadow of God, but the king is God's reflection, noting that being restricted to royalty.
Yeah. The language, yes, it's a royal expression. It's actually fairly common in quite a number of Egyptian texts, less so Mesopotamian texts, and I mean this is the concession that Josh and I are happy to make here. He's holding his breath. He's wondering what I'm about to concede here, but this is the concession that I think we're both happy to make, is that Christian abolitionists certainly contributed to the end of slavery, and that it was their understanding of what's going on in Genesis 1, which was a driving force behind that. Now, and I appreciate that you guys approach this from a theological perspective, in an effort to demonstrate, I think, what are already deeply held convictions, visceral ideas about about this. But as as scholars of the Bible within biblical scholarship, something that we're intent on doing is attempting to understand these texts in two ways. First, in the ways in which they were written and promoted to their original audience within their original contexts, then as they were developed and as they were understood and received by various communities and reshaped as they continued to be received over the course of hundreds and thousands of years. And as much as I appreciate the contribution of a text like Genesis 1 to more modern ideas of the dignity of man, as a scholar, when I go back and I look at what's taking place in Genesis 1, before I can get there, I have to understand the place of this text within its original context. And so much of what's happening there just is, I would say that the focus on human dignity as a feature in that passage is missing the point, or just getting the original context wrong, which is fine because this is how texts work, right? Texts aren't static and they don't stay in the same place. They are read and reread and recontextualized over time. But for my part, I need to know first what this text is about when it was first written. So I think in that sense, I mean, in everything that I can see, and this certainly works, with it, understanding what this is, being created in the image of God, in the first place. From everything that I can see, this has to do with human physicality, or maybe a better way to put it is human wholeness, as the whole person being a reflection of God as distinct from the rest of nature or the rest of the created animals on day 6. It's not an expression of human equality in terms of our relationship one to another. It's in terms of our relationship to the Creator. And this is something that is carried forward in or the earliest texts that we have from Judaism, which reflect on this idea. Is, in Ben Sira, you have a handful of texts from the Dead Sea Scrolls. I think or was another one, the Book of Jubilees. Well, actually, the Book of Jubilees just ignores the image of God altogether. But the focus for the first readers was not on, man and his relationship to one another in terms of everyone sharing this image. It was all about the relationship of man to the rest of nature. Man was the image of God. Man was the representative, or when I teach this, I often talk about man as the victory stele of God over over the forces of nature and the chaos that has just been vanquished in making creation. So I'll just finish by saying I have no.
Thoughts. Go ahead.
No,
Okay.
I'll just finish by saying I have no objection to the ways in which this text have been shaped over time, but I think it's really important to gain a clear understanding of where it started and how it was intended when it was first written.
I think that that's fair. So we should like go back to the literary context of Genesis and the other parts of Genesis. But I do think more than that, it really is affirming the intrinsic goodness of human beings. And because of that, the moral duties they have towards one another. So, for example, in Genesis 9:6, you see, whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed, for God made man in his own image. So we see a prescription of treating murder with the most serious punishment because of the unique value of human beings being made in the image and likeness of God. Also, we have the creation story. It's well, if you go to Genesis 6 through 7, the flood, it has parallels to the Epic of Gilgamesh. It probably also has parallels to an older epic called the Epic of Atrahasis. And what's interesting there, the flood, I think the author seems to be subverting many of these common stories, because in Atrahasis, the gods flood the earth because humans are too noisy and commotion, and there's an overpopulation crisis. The presence of so many humans is bad. But in Genesis, it's completely inverted to say, no, God says, be fruitful and multiply. Like he wants lots of humans because they're good. So I do think when we go back to the original source text, it does make the image and likeness of God much, much richer to understand.
And that's all I was going to say too. Trent took the words out of my mouth, but he went on beyond what I was going to say. I was just going to hammer Genesis 9:6. I don't think it's credible to say in its original literary context, creation in the image of God didn't have implications that made the emancipation effort a legitimate application of the text, because in the text itself, there's a similar concern for the value of human life on the basis of creation in the image of God. That's how I'm looking at it.
So in Westbrook's commentary, he says this about Genesis 9:6. The explanation given of Genesis 1:26 to 27 shows that it's not a question of quality in people, but of the fact God has created people as his counterpart, and that human beings can have a history with God. The image and likeness of God is only there in the relationship between God and the individual. Murder then is a direct attack on God's right of dominion. Again, this is still a reflection back on not so much this is still a reflection back on the point of the story in Genesis 1, which is dominion, dominion over nature.
I don't think that necessarily even that explanation you gave, because when we look in Ephesians in the New Testament, Paul says to slave
Well, we're
owners, be
talking
kind to
about
your...
Ephesians now, though, aren't we?
No,
We're
no, no. But I'm
supposed to be
saying that
looking at what's happening in the original context of the
no, I'm not
story.
disagreeing. I'm not disagreeing with that rationale you gave. The idea is that
Okay.
you can't murder someone because that's God's territory. Like he has the dominion over that. But we also see in the New Testament and later on in other Christian writings, this idea that you can't enslave a man because no man can belong to a man. All people belong to God. And so to understand that radical ownership of him does contribute to an important element of human beings understanding their proper role in the moral life.
Yeah. And that was Gregory of Nyssa's rationale, just picking up on Trent's comments there, is basically every human being is made in the image of God. Therefore, you actually can't enslave them. There's something about that's actually an impossible thing to do. That's one of his arguments. He built several others. And, Gregory, this is where, again, I'm seeing the usage of Genesis 1 by Christians like Gregory, who, as I read him in the 4th century, basically gave the strongest criticism of slavery as an institution that I've been able to find in the pre-modern world anywhere. And the usage of Genesis 1 that he has there seems to me to be running in the same grooves of the thinking of Genesis 9:6. So I would say that's a legitimate Christian usage of Genesis 1.
It's not something that you see earlier, though. Like I said, within the early Jewish texts that we have, the focus is consistent in terms of emphasizing human dominion as opposed to the interrelationships of people.
Would you see Genesis 9:6 as a relevant text here?
Yes, but in as much as Westbrook has suggested that that this again is still a reflection of dominion, of God's dominion and his his rights on the person. Do you have something?
Yeah,
Josh?
I think to sort of take a step back, because what I don't want to do, I think I've been watching the side chat and people are screaming. At least the
I
ones that
never
I've seen
watch
for
the chat
Leviticus
during the
25.
thing.
Yeah.
You have more.
I shouldn't be watching it.
I only watch when I'm not talking.
I think it's important for us to say, because Kipp and I talked about this on the phone before we came on here, like theological interpretations of texts. Great.
Yep.
And I was wondering if the thumbs up thing was going to pop up, Gavin.
Yeah, right. Let's see
Oh,
if we can do it.
Yeah, go in your
great.
FaceTime, turn on reactions.
Right. But so when people take interpretive frameworks, like the abolitionists, right, and they say that this is how we understand this text to fit in through our Christian lens, amazing. That's fine. That's not. This is why I really don't buck a lot against even this Matthew 19 thing, right? I don't think it's right, but I like to say that I think it's the strongest case because it's a theological interpretation, right? It's coming to the text through a theological lens. And that's not really what Kipp and I do. And so I'm happy, very, very happy, if at the end of this conversation, we all agree on things like there was debt and however you want to call it, chattel slavery, people owning other people as property, right? Being able to pass them on as inheritance, having the master can make them serve forever, all of these things. If we can all agree on those sort of basic points, like I will say success on my part, because these are the big things that we run into all the time, right? I do think clearly that Deuteronomy 23 does not do the legwork that I think you guys think that it does. And I would like to talk about that passage. But like for the most part on these theological interpretations, I have questions about it. I think I have pushback on them, but they're not really like a huge deal to me, if that makes sense.
I understand. And I think for us and Christians understanding Scripture, I think Pope Benedict XVI once said that Christianity is not a religion of the book. It's a religion of the Word who is Jesus Christ. That we have to understand there's, of course, a literal sense of the text as well as a spiritual or a larger sense of it. And so in understanding what God has revealed, we have to balance that. I'm not going to get into this because it's a whole different topic we could talk for hours and hours about. But the other big one in the Old Testament is the allegations of genocide. And so is the text, is it literally saying this, or is there something else that's involved? And a greater clarity can arrive about what verse, what's involved there. Or a simple example might be in the Old Testament. It often uses the phrase "he thought in his heart." And a lot of us interpret that poetically, but everybody actually did think the seat of human thinking, what prior to the 17th century, was in the heart, not the brain. That took a little bit while for people to figure out. That's not a problem for Christianity because we don't treat the Bible like human anatomy textbook, but that doesn't mean everything that's being said there is false. That it still reveals that someone in their innermost being thought of something and cherished this. And so I think that the theological explanations or the deeper explanations of the text, they are not escape hatches. They're not irrelevancies. They are connected to the literal sense, but they help us in this general trajectory of understanding what God is revealing through a broken and sinful people who develop their understanding throughout time, if that makes sense.
And I would say, just adding on to that, all of us have biases and all of us read a text in relation to larger things that we bring to the text.
Of course.
So this is the human dynamic that we can't escape. In my response video, I was trying to kind of acknowledge
We're very
my
cynical.
biases, that I am a Christian. I love the Bible. I to me, it's like oxygen and hope. And I just try to acknowledge my biases, but we all have those biases. But I don't think so. But the claim that I'm attempting to put forward is that Genesis 1 isn't only relevant or important at this juncture of the conversation in terms of a theological deployment, but actually just in its textual meaning. And so again, here we're to demarcate the agreement, the disagreement. I think we have agreement that the claim of the text itself is unique to democratize the imago Dei. Every single human being is in the image of God. You've got the Genesis 9 prohibition of murder on the basis of that 8 chapters later. And then where we're disagreeing is sort of theological or worldview implications from that. And so, I'm just trying to skate out, I guess, where we agree, where we don't.
So could we go to Deuteronomy 23? Just because
Sure.
I think it's something. It's
Look at the
it's one of your
time
two
here, right?
passages.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, but just to transition there, so that we're clear on the first passage that you guys were talking about. Just as I think you guys have made it clear what your positions are on it. I think what we would say is, if these are debt slaves in 2021, 26 to 27, which again is sort of the majority position among scholars, then I think it's certainly 115 laws of Hammurabi, 115 and 116 parallel 20 and 21. And that legal rationale, I think, would very easily carry forward, given other places like the Middle Assyrian laws A44, where you can't do certain physical things to debt slaves. They have to be chattel slaves before you do them. So that would be our position. If it is debt slavery, which again, most people think that it is, I don't think there's this big distinction here.
Could you just clarify that? I'm sorry, but it's probably because we're 2 hours in. I'm not seeing why the fact that, supposing it was debt slave, why that would minimize the other differences that we've identified in terms of from the master to his own slave versus a third party to the slave, the difference between death versus physical mistreatment. To me, it's still, whether it's a debt slave or chattel slavery, it's still a big deal. If you're talking about, I harmed that other person's slave, now I owe their master money, versus, or I killed them actually, versus you as the master can't harm your own slave, debt or chattel, either way. It still seems to me, I guess I'm not following.
Yeah, sure. Okay. So first, what you said there last is exactly what we see in 28 to 32 with the goring ox, right? Person A didn't control their ox, killed somebody else's slave B, I pay 30 shekels of silver to their master. Correct. So that's precisely what we do see. If these are debt slaves, so let's paint the picture here, because the way that 2021, the thing, if it is a debt slave, the thing that it's probably envisioning here is somebody like a distraint or a pledge, right? So it very well may not be the paterfamilias, right? The head of the household that is the debt slave. It may be his daughter, his son. It may be his slave, right? But the point is that debt slave need not be the paterfamilias himself. It may be, but the text doesn't make that sort of thing explicit. And that's what's being described here in Laws of Hammurabi 115 and 116. So in this case, this is, if a debt slave is considered to be someone who will eventually be free again, right? Go back to their normal status as a non-slave, right? And in that case, they have certain protections afforded to them because they are not considered chattel. It doesn't mean that you could do anything you want to chattel, but it does mean that there are more restrictions put in place. And so if that's the case, that's what we see in Laws of Hammurabi. If it is debt slavery here, that means that the legal rationale that you see in 20 to 21 is the same as you see, and the same punishments, right? In 2021 and Laws of Hammurabi 115 and 116. What that would mean then is that if this were a pledge, right, someone who is there as silver, as you see in like Middle Assyrian laws C2, 5, sorry, I don't have that on the top of my head. Those that are like a pledge that is illegally alienated, sold by a master to somebody else, forfeits the debt. The pledge is set free. Like the pledge is brought back, and the debt is repaid, or the debt is canceled, and the master is beaten. He suffers. I should probably just read that, shouldn't I? But and I won't. We don't have time. Sorry. So that's the point. I don't know if that made sense, Gavin.
Well, I guess what's hard is just when you read it, there's 3 people. The translation I have here, if the prisoner die in prison from blows or maltreatment, the master of the prisoner shall convict the merchant before the judge. If he, the one who died, was a freeborn man, the son of the merchant shall be put to death. If it was a slave, he shall pay 1/3 of a mina of gold. I'm guessing, it's being paid to that other party. The merchant pays to the master, and all that the master of the prisoner gave, he shall forfeit. Do you see where we're coming from? Where it's really hard that in Law of Hammurabi 116, there are 3 parties. One is deceased, but 2, there's the master and the merchant. But in Exodus 21, there's only 2 parties, the master and the slave. It does seem really different.
No, what I'm describing is essentially 2 Kings 4:1, right? Where you have the widow woman who has defaulted on her loan and the creditor is coming to take the 2 children. These are either being taken as distraints or they're being taken just as simple debt slaves. And if the law were followed, if that were in place, that's a whole nother discussion, then those 2 would serve for the 6-year period and be released, right? Ostensibly.
Are you saying if the creditor kills them, he's got to pay the person they owe the debt to?
No, in that circumstance, here we are.
I'm sorry, the creditor hires somebody else to do it.
Here, let me just paint the picture of what Law Hammurabi 115 and 16 is doing. You have someone who has defaulted on a loan, right? Or owes the creditor, the person who will become the master, something, right? And what this person does is says, this is actually a distraint. So the creditor is within his rights to come to the debtor, just like in 2 Kings 4:1, and take somebody, be it a free son, a daughter, or a slave of this person's, and hold them in distraint. And, they can, to try to get them to pay, right? Okay. If in that circumstance, the creditor who is holding the distraint abuses and kills the son, let's say, that he's taken from this debtor,
then his son gets killed.
His son gets killed, right? If those are debt slaves, distraints, pledges, they're debt slaves, right? They're there because of a debt. If this is the case in 20 to 21 and 26 to 27, that these are Israelite, most likely debt slaves, then this is the same sort of thing that's going on, be it the paterfamilias gets killed as the debt slave, then that vengeance is taken out on him. Or if it's a son of the debtor that gets killed, right? Then that person gets killed. It's because it's ostensibly another free person.
Right, but the main harm here is the punishment is due to the fact you killed someone who belonged to someone else, and the punishment will vary based on the social value of that
That's
individual, be it a free son
or
if it's a slave. But it's still the case. The punishment is because you've harmed someone who belonged to someone else, not someone who in the virtue of them belonged to you. They only belong to you temporarily.
Sorry,
and
I thought you were describing Exodus 21 in that description.
No, I'm describing Law of Hammurabi 115, 116.
That's what I'm saying. What you just described is what I'm saying is happening in 20, 21, 26 to 27.
Can we put up those verses from Exodus 21? I'm just, to me, it seems to me that a scenario is being read into those verses. I just don't, I'm not following how we're getting to that, because, I can see it on the screen there. An owner who hits a male or servant slave in the eye. Okay, well, part of it is translation, because my translation says, when a man strikes the eye of his slave, male or female, and destroys it, he shall let the slave go free. Maybe there's where we're having a little bit of an impasse. Now I'm understanding. So you're saying this isn't the master's own slave that's in view?
I'm saying that this is a debt slave. So under that terminology, during that period of debt servitude, they would be referred to, right, as that person's slave.
Oh, okay. All right. Okay.
Yeah.
So I guess we're just, I don't want to beat a dead horse here on this Exodus 21. I know you want to get to Deuteronomy 3. I guess we're just demarcating how we're reading Exodus 21.
Yes, there are no laws in the Old Testament against beating dead horses. So,
hey, there you go.
But if one
So
was
it was-
burdened and fallen over, even if he is your enemy, you ought to help them up. So your
This would be
enemy's
helpful for
donkey.
viewers just to think through the verse, read the commentaries, look
Yeah.
into it, and just work at this. And but I know we only got 20 minutes left, and Josh, you wanted to get
Right.
to Deuteronomy 23.
Never
So
even got to Leviticus 25.
Right. Oh
Yeah,
God.
that's
Sorry.
crazy, eh?
I need to talk.
But this has been a fun discussion.
It has.
gotta say.
Yeah.
Don't blame
think it's
me
productive.
because I'm having too much fun.
No,
Okay.
Derek,
So-
you've really been the key here, holding it
Yeah.
together.
Really.
If it weren't for
Yeah.
me, how would you guys have even done this?
So the verses here in Deuteronomy 23. If you could scroll down. Actually, that's probably yeah, it's just right at the bottom. If a slave has taken refuge with you, do not hand them over to their master. Let them live among you wherever they like and in whatever town they choose. Do not oppress them. So the nice thing about this discussion is we all agree this is a foreign slave escaping across the border, right? That is a really difficult place to get to in many, many discussions. And that is just sort of the consensus position.
I certainly am with you on that. I don't want to speak for
Yeah.
Trent, but that's my take on it.
Yeah, I think that I agree with you, and I think the previous verse is what gives that, and it's about showing kindness to that person because it uses the same language. Because the Lord your God walks in the midst of your camp to save you and go up the enemies before you. It's interesting. He uses that language and it kind of repeats it. Lord your God walks in the midst of your camp. It says this person shall dwell with you in your midst. So it's interesting. Once again, that big theme in the Old Testament: do not oppress the foreigner because you are foreigners in the land of Egypt.
Yeah. So let me tell you the places that I think we also agree with you. I think this is it's striking to me that there's nothing in the law collections that talks about what to do with a runaway slave. Right, that is striking to me. So, and I don't think I've ever been shy about saying that. And it is also striking, although very understandable when we talk about it, that they are to just take a hands-off approach to this foreign slave that has come into their midst. But that second one is actually, I think it's reasonably clear what it's describing. Deuteronomy is set up in the form of a vassal treaty, right? And one of the big things in Samuel Gringus, he has a book, the title of which is escaping me now. It has to do with like laws in the Bible and rabbinic literature, something like that. But he deals with all the ancient Near Eastern law that overlaps with the biblical law, that overlaps with rabbinic law, and tries to sort of trace the trajectory there. But what he and he's not new in doing this, 2011 publication. What scholars have for quite a long time now recognized is that this is in reference to extradition treaties. So if you look through, and I have several of them here, but I won't read them for time's sake. There are extradition treaties, almost all of them, when they're parity treaties, right? Or where you have a vassal that's agreeing to, like a superior state. So, somebody under the Neo-Assyrian Empire would be the vassal. They will always have not always, but often have these clauses. Hey, if our slaves escape to your country, you better send them back. That's part of the extradition clause. And what Deuteronomy is saying here is don't have extradition treaties with the nations around you because you're not at parity with them and you're certainly not a vassal to them, right? There are other implications for that, I think, but the way that this verse is usually sort of fleshed out in this context is that, look, slaves can run away. You don't have to send them back. This is totally different from anything else in the ancient Near East because like any slave could just run away. And one, I'm glad that that's not what you guys are saying. But I don't know that I would call this an improvement. And the reason that I don't know an improvement is because what the context of this is, it's not, I don't think the emphasis here is on like the the fact that slaves are to be given all this great like welfare in general, right? I think the point here is that Israel is supposed to be the head. The other nations are supposed to be like the tail, right? And Israel's not going to have these parity treaties. They're going to be the ones creating vassals. We see this in Deuteronomy 20. And so this extradition clause, I think that's the length of it, right? And we could talk about that more, but did that make sense?
I have a question about that, if I may. So I think I understand what you're proposing, and I think always the question for a proposal is, what best explains the text. Now, when I'm looking at this text, the final little addition of the thread throughout seems to be reflecting compassion for this runaway foreign servant, to me, and I see that in several ways, but especially with the final little phrase. I think in your translation it said, "You shall not oppress him." My translation's a little bit different from that. I think it says, "You shall do him no wrong." But it seems to me that if the motivation, I could concede and agree with you that that's the larger framework in which to understand this, without that being mutually exclusive to a concern for the basically a compassion for this person. Now, the reason I think that's totally plausible is two things. Number one, it accords with, again, what I see as a motif coming out again and again. I've counted 36 of them. Look out for the fatherless. Look out for the sojourner. Look out for the widow. Look out for that person who's vulnerable, because you know what that feels like because you were in Egypt. That's all. That's all over. The second thing is, why even say you shall not harm him? You shall not oppress him. If it's purely a matter of politics, or you didn't say that, but I'm speaking off the top of my head here. If it's more in that direction, then it really actually wouldn't be as important to then care for the person's welfare once they're there living.
So let me because I'll forget it. I'm so sorry. So first of all, throughout the ancient Near East, that's a trope: care for the foreigner, care for the oppressed. Like Laws of Eshnunna 41. Like if a foreigner comes into your midst, and it gives 3 different types of foreigners, 3 different Akkadian terms for foreigner.
But I said, because you know what that feels like in Egypt,
right? That's the only real development there. It's not what to do; it's why.
Would you say
right?
it's as emphasized in these other ancient texts?
Oh no, there is no because there is no origin story of being slaves in another country, right?
But just the law, but would you say that the call for compassion to the outsider is as emphasized in the other ancient Near Eastern texts then? Because by my lights, from what I can tell, this is a particular point of emphasis in the Hebrew Bible.
So to the foreigner specifically, no. It's there, right? To the vulnerable, absolutely. It's like the king's job is to take care of the vulnerable. So I don't know that it will bear the weight of that sort of thing. But to speak specifically to why it says do not oppress them, and it goes back to what you're saying about the foreigner. Foreigners are those in the Hebrew Bible that are corners of the field. It's like in Leviticus and other places, like corners of the field or the sides of the field are not to be completely harvested. You leave those for the vulnerable, the orphan, the widow, the foreigner. So these are the vulnerable in society, and you're supposed to take care of those. And so, like, essentially what's being described here, the do not oppress, is essentially don't take him as a slave yourself, right? So essentially the person coming in is to just be a ger, right? He's to function as a sojourner with you, right? So it's then falling under all these other statements that you're drawing attention to, right? He just becomes a foreigner. But what that doesn't do, one, and I'll read a quick quote here from that book I referenced, Sam Gringus's book. No effort should be made either to conceal the fugitive or to hold him. And there is likewise no duty to facilitate the owner's recovery of a runaway slave by bringing his whereabouts to the attention of the authorities. This law, therefore, tells Israelites to do nothing, neither to the slave, like the oppressive part, nor to assist his master in recovering his fugitive slave. So that they're just supposed to take this hands-off approach, right? He is a resident like a sojourner with them. And that's perfectly consistent with what we see in the rest of the text. But I don't think this is a slavery law, if that makes sense. Like, I don't think the focus here is on slaves that run away. This is about a foreign slave that's coming. It's a very specific kind. So I don't think that it speaks to slavery mentality of the people or of the law collections. Does that make sense, that distinction?
From a larger context, though, would you say that that the Hebrew Bible, compared to the other A&E codes, of all these codes, it is the least concerned about the problem of runaway slaves?
Yeah, well, from what we see in it, sure. Yeah, because it just doesn't talk about it. Yeah.
And I would just say what you're saying makes sense to me, Josh. I guess we're looking at the text and we're seeing it a little differently, and certainly our background, informs that. Mine does. Mine certainly does. I'm coming at the text from a framework and so forth. I'm seeing compassion in this verse. I'm seeing not just leave him alone, but a specific command not to harm him. The command to let him dwell wherever it suits him. That's not necessary to say that, but it does say that. And I'll read a quote of my own to show that this is not just me who sees it this way. Daniel Block in his commentary says the magnanimity of verse 16 is extraordinary. The Israelite must not only let fugitive slaves reside among them, but also allow them to choose a place in any town that seems good to them. Nor may Israelites exploit and oppress them. In effect, foreign slaves who fled to Israel were free to live anywhere without fear. And I would just basically say, whatever the motive is, the consequence of this law is remarkable. If the Israelites obey this law, then Israel becomes a safe haven for runaway slaves who are foreign. So even if you take the most cynical reading possible in terms of the motivation and say there's no compassion whatsoever for this person as a person made in God's image, still, nonetheless, the consequence seems good and unique.
Because I would say that for an ancient person to see this individual, a fugitive slave from another kingdom, who is now in the land, who does not have kin, does not have clan, does not have social credit, that the immediate suspicion would be this person is a threat. They are a consumer of resources. They are someone who is a threat to the established order. So I would say that even if it says not to do anything, to go against that general prevailing cultural prejudice of this is a threat to what we have here, this outsider coming in to give these accommodations is, magnanimous would be a word to describe it.
So I don't think that on the whole, that sort of feeling of a foreigner coming in would be a threat, would be a thing. Vulnerable foreigners are vulnerable. Like there's a proverb that
not that they're like a warrior, but like they're somebody who's going to be after resources too, but they're not someone who has an established farmland and established. Mm-hmm. I'm not saying there's some kind of nomadic warrior, but more a threat in the ancient world is like there's a very finite, limited amount of resources we're barely hanging on to. And the more mouths to feed, you have to ask, does this person put in more than they're getting out? Which is what often deals with the legislation about dowries and about a lot of these issues is about the threat is more passive. It's that, hey, we've got limited resources here. How many more people can fit in the boat? Now, if someone comes and they're, clan, they have a farm, they have flock, that's one thing. That's kind of how I see it.
Well, I know we're coming up on the 2.5 hour here. I'm wondering, could we give like a quick, and I do mean that quick, I will be quick, summary of things that I think are key? Because one of the things that I want to say at the end here is that I want to emphasize again what slavery was, right? It's one thing to talk about where in some of these places it might seem better or be better from our modern vantage point. But I think we need to place that in the context of what it still was, right? So would that be okay if we?
Yeah. And maybe we can answer the same question. We can answer the same question and just kind of tie it together.
Yeah. So things that slavery was, by the time you get to Leviticus 25, which I think is probably the last, it's part of the Holiness Code. Here the text is describing you can't treat fellow Israelites as slaves anymore, right? So that there's something, at least in the mind of the writer or of that school of writers, that is saying okay, like slavery, we shouldn't be subjecting our fellow Israelites to this status, right? And if the text were to stop there, then I think there'd be this. I think this Matthew 19 case would be a lot stronger. But the problem is, then the text goes on to say, so if you want slaves, permanent slaves, you get them from the nations around you, you get them from tenant farmers that are living in your midst, and from their children that they bear in the land, from their descendants. They become the Hebrew word is achuzah, which is the word that's used to describe that landed property that everybody's divided out, that inherited property that goes back in the Jubilee. So what's actually happening by calling them achuzah is they become part of that landed property. So during the Jubilee, that slave would not be released. That slave would go back with the landed property to the Israelite owner. Like, that's the point. So they're to serve le'olam, in perpetuity, forever, we say.
In a lifetime, yeah.
Yeah, they're passed on as inheritance. And then it emphasizes at the end, but you must not rule over your fellow Israelites with violence, right? So whatever it is that we say are developments, these foreign slaves don't get that. And so I think that's probably an important point to sort of emphasize, because we didn't get there. So yeah, I said I'd be short. So that was short.
And I think what I would say is that slavery was a universal human institution in a time before, essentially before reliable forms of credit could be invented. And it's no coincidence, reliable forms of credit and reliable forms of social control and crime deterrence. So prisons, things like that. So it's no coincidence. Every society, Asia, the Americas before the arrival of Columbus, Africa, everyone had some form of slavery to provide social credit and social control to maintain social stability. And so that is something to see against the backdrop of that. We see, I would say from our perspective, we do see very important key elements of slavery in the Old Testament being superior to other societies in virtue of the fact that the Israelites recognize their own unique history of being slaves in Egypt and of how God dealt with them and they should deal with others. And I think, Gavin, I agree, there is a trajectory. I agree there's a trajectory, and it needs to continue beyond Leviticus 25. That the goal here in the Old Testament is to help the Israelites to see, love your neighbor as yourself. Like, Jesus didn't invent that. That's in Leviticus 19. But by the time of Christ, we see that gets expanded. Love your neighbor. Who's my neighbor? It's not just a fellow Israelite. It's the Samaritan. It's the person it's just another human you absolutely despise. And that expanding of who our neighbor is what contributed to the unique phenomena that it was France, I think, in the 14th century. That was the first kingdom to ever outlaw slavery. Still continued on in the New World, in China and Asia. That expansion of who is my neighbor, who is the person made in the image of God, I do think goes all the way back what Gavin said to Genesis 1. And for us, I appreciate you guys, and Josh, I really appreciate your book. And as we talk about this, it is very important to get the facts correct, but you can tell there's always this instinctual tug. So what? What are the philosophical, religious implications of this? And I think it's good for us to check the facts and then deeply meditate on their implications.
I'll just briefly state my own uncertainty about exactly where Leviticus 25 plays into the development, because I haven't thought about that enough yet. You do still have Hebrew servants of some kind there who go free in this. They work as a sojourner or a hired hand, and they go free in the 7th year. I will say on that passage, first of all, no one has said this, but just for people following along, one of the dynamics was I was responding to Mindshift's claim. He was saying Leviticus 25, transatlantic slave trade, same thing to a T. I was pointing out, no, this is not forced abduction of a free person. This is someone being sold, and it can work in reverse. The foreigner can come into Israel and acquire a Hebrew slave. I do think that's relevant and kind of just shows the picture here of how this is functioning, as Trent said, in a world where you don't have any credit or social security or safety net. You can sell yourself into servanthood, and I think that's how it's functioning. My only final comment would be, people have heard my broader case, but I would say, The reason I love the Bible and the story that it tells is I think this is the story that gets us to where we are. I think this is the story that basically tells of how we got to where we are, where we do see the clear value that all four of us share for universal human dignity, which basically didn't exist in the ancient world. And I think this is the set of dominoes that got us to where we are. People have heard me make that case, but thank you both. I think this has been a really, really positive discussion, and feel free to say anything else you want. I'm not trying to close it down. And thanks to Trent too for joining me.
Yes, thank you, Trent. Since we're finishing on Leviticus 25, I think it's useful to point out that the whole theme of this particular chapter, and why the question of foreigners versus Israelites is so critical to it, is because this has to do with the relationship between the people of the land and their akuzah and their holdings within the land. There's a critical point in that passage where Yahweh instructs that the land is not to be sold in perpetuity because it belongs to him, and that the Israelites are just holding on to it for a time. And then Yahweh also says the reason why you can't hold your fellow Israelites in perpetuity is because you are all my slaves. And this actually plays into this this ever-present theme of redemption, which I tend to see probably a little bit differently than Gavin and Trent, that runs through the Hebrew Bible. It's not so much a call to liberty, or at least a universal call to liberty. It's Yahweh going into Egypt and taking back what already belongs to him. These are his people. These are his slaves. Egypt had no claim on them, which is why he pulled them out of this unjust situation. So and that's why, when it comes to it's in this particular passage, that's the reason why this doesn't apply to foreigners, is because they're not Yahweh's property.
Are we at final statements here?
Yeah,
okay.
I think
and
so.
Josh, are you the last guy to say anything, or
Kipp's it.
okay?
So yeah, I think that's.
Did you wrap it up, Kipp?
Yeah, I'm done. I'm good.
Look, there's so much. I want to, first of all, I want to commend all of you, because I think this is the first time I've ever witnessed something that mature with such a hot topic where you guys totally disagree at the end of the day about the conclusions you're taking.
Yeah, but you guys are all dumb faces. So just want to throw that in right at the end. There, we made it immature.
You have to say it was because of me that you guys behaved, because I was so involved the whole time. You know what I mean?
You probably could have got a whole movie in during that.
Yeah. Do what?
He did.
You probably got a whole movie in.
He was back there eating.
I actually was editing a thumbnail and doing all sorts of Mid-Journey and stuff. Yeah. Took a few phone calls, got a pedicure, manicure, sorry. Medicare. Anyway, this has been fantastic. I learned a lot listening to both angles and understanding both where you're coming from and how you're trying to understand it. And I hope many people who were watching this did as well. People are asking, what about the super chats? Get to our super chats. Look, I said this at the beginning, and I apologize if you did not come at the start of this. We will cover those, and we will cover them in a different setting. The reason behind that, cards on the table, is that there's a lot of tribalism, and some people are not going to like Josh and Kipp, and some people are not going to like Gavin and Trent. And we wanted to prevent any types of friction potentially while you guys are here. It's better to address these things in our own settings for the sake of trying to create a climate that is going to allow these kind of conversations to thrive and not become toxic. And I almost used the word like locker room word, you know what, measuring contest. And we don't need that to turn into that. This is a conversation and we want to have these more. So,
and
really
I'm very
appreciate you guys.
happy to come. I know Kipp and I are very happy to like come back on and do a stream, just to answer those questions at a later time, not tonight.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's
Thank
late
you
for you guys.
Is there anything else that we didn't cover as we're on our way out?
No, I
just wanna say thank
I really
you.
appreciate
Yeah.
you guys coming on and doing
Yeah.
this. Thank you very
It was
much.
excellent.
Well, what's funny, actually, Josh and Kipp, for a long time, people have asked, like, oh, will you debate this? Will you debate that? And there's some topics I've told people like, well, I'm not really going to debate that because if I'm so far apart from my interlocutor and we don't have common ground, I just don't see if it's going to go anywhere. Like I've said before, I'm not going to debate whether Christ had two wills with a Jehovah's Witness or a Mormon because our Christology is just so radically different that's so far beyond what I would say. And so one example I used to give was, I'm not going to debate biblical slavery with an atheist because look, we're already so far apart. I don't know how it would be productive. And I've seen some other debates on the internet where I thought that was a very unproductive engagement. I definitely don't want to be involved in anything like that. But this, I think you guys are very unique to change I knew both of you from your previous work, and that gave me the courage to think, no, I think this actually could be a productive conversation. And I was very happy that it was.
Well, we really appreciate it.
I was
Thanks,
impressed.
yeah.
I'll say
Yeah.
that.
Fantastic discussion. Thank you guys so much.
Thank you. And everyone have a wonderful night. Don't forget to like on whoever's platform you're at. Like it, share it, comment. Let's do this again sometime.